Ever noticed how the night feels different when someone is here with you? I'm Joe, and I'm happy to spend these quiet hours by your side. So turn down the lights, get cozy, and let these stories take your mind far away from whatever has been on your shoulders today. There are just a few ads in the first 10 minutes, then nothing but calm stories until the sun comes up. If this becomes your favorite way to end the day, I'd love it if you subscribed and left a like. Now, let's drift off into tonight together. I spent 11 years wearing the badge in a small county in northern Michigan, and most of what I dealt with was boring. Speeding tickets, drunk guys fighting outside the one bar we had, the occasional stolen snowmobile. You learn to expect the same handful of problems on repeat. But there's one night from my 3rd year that I've never told anyone about, not even my wife, because every time I try to say it out loud, it sounds insane. I'm only writing it down now because I retired last spring and figured somebody should know. My name is Grant, by the way. Back then I was young, 32. Still thought I understood how the world worked. It was late October, the kind of cold where your breath hangs in front of your face, and the roads get that black shine that means ice is coming. I was working the overnight shift alone, which was normal for us since the department was small and money was tight. Around 1 in the morning, dispatch sent me a welfare check. Somebody had called, worried about an older woman named Dorothy, who lived way out on Coldwater Road. Her daughter down in Ohio hadn't heard from her in 4 days and couldn't reach her by phone. Now, welfare checks are usually nothing. Half the time, the person just went to visit family and forgot to mention it, so I wasn't worried. I remember I even stopped for a coffee at the gas station before heading out that way, figuring I'd be back at the station within the hour. Coldwater Road is about 20 minutes outside of town, and the last stretch of it turns to gravel. There are no streetlights out there, just farmland, then woods, then more woods. Dorothy's house sat at the very end, an old white farmhouse that had clearly seen better days. As I pulled up my headlights, washed across the front of it, and the first thing I noticed was that every single light in the house was on, every window glowing yellow, at 1 in the morning. That struck me as odd, but not alarming. Old folks keep strange hours. Maybe she couldn't sleep. I parked, grabbed my flashlight even though I didn't really need it, and walked up to the porch. The steps groaned under my boots. I called out her name, said I was with the sheriff's department, just here to check on her. Nothing came back. The wind was moving through the bare trees behind the house, and other than that, the whole place was dead quiet. I tried the front door. It was unlocked, which again isn't strange out in the country. People don't lock up the way they do in the city. I pushed it open and leaned my head inside. "Dorothy, it's the police. You okay in here?" And that's when I got the first feeling that something was wrong. Not because of what I saw, but because of the smell. It wasn't a bad smell exactly. It was food, fresh food. Somebody had recently cooked a big meal in that house, and I could smell it strong, like I'd walked into a restaurant kitchen. But the place was silent, and I was standing in a doorway at 1 in the morning with all the lights blazing and nobody answering me. I stepped inside slow, because that's what training beats into you. You never rush into a house you don't know. My hand stayed near my belt, not on the weapon, just close enough that it made me feel a little better. The front door opened right into a living room, and everything in there looked ordinary in a way that somehow made it worse. There was a recliner with a folded blanket over the arm. A television, turned off. Framed photos on the wall of people I didn't recognize, kids and grandkids probably. All of them smiling in that stiff way people do for pictures. A little side table had a pair of reading glasses, sitting on top of an open paperback, like somebody had set them down for just a second and meant to come right back. The smell of food was even stronger now that I was fully inside. Roast beef, maybe, and something baked. I remember my stomach actually growled, which felt like the wrong thing for my body to be doing right then. I kept calling her name as I moved through. The living room connected to a hallway, and off the hallway was the kitchen, so I went there first because that's where the smell was coming from. When I stepped into the kitchen doorway, I stopped cold. The table was set for dinner, not just set, but full. There were plates of food laid out, a whole roast in the center, potatoes, green beans, a basket of rolls, the works. Steam was still rising off some of it. 2 places were set, one at each end of the table, complete with folded napkins and glasses of water. And both chairs were empty. I stood there trying to make sense of it. A meal that fresh doesn't cook itself. Somebody had been in that kitchen within the last 15 or 20 minutes, and yet the house was so quiet I could hear the second hand ticking on a clock somewhere down the hall. "Dorothy," I said again, louder this time. "My name's Grant. I'm with the county. If you can hear me, I need you to answer." Silence after my own voice felt heavy. That's the only way I know how to describe it. Like the house was holding its breath along with me. I checked the rest of the ground floor. There was a small bathroom, empty. A back room that looked like a sewing area, empty. A door that led down to a basement. But it was shut, and I decided to leave that for last. The way you do when part of you is hoping you won't have to open it at all. Everywhere I went, the lights were on. Every lamp, every overhead fixture, every bulb in the place burning bright. I've thought about that detail more than any other over the years. Because if you were an old woman living alone out in the middle of nowhere, why in the world would you have every light in your house turned on in the dead of night? Upstairs was next. The staircase was narrow, and the wood was worn smooth in the center of each step from decades of feet. As I climbed, I heard the boards complaining under me, and I kept glancing back over my shoulder without really meaning to. There's a thing that happens to you when you're alone in a strange place at night, where your body starts reacting to things your mind hasn't caught up to yet. My skin was prickling. The hair on my arms was standing up. I couldn't have told you why. Nothing had actually happened. But some older animal part of my brain had already decided we needed to leave. There were 3 rooms upstairs. The first was a spare bedroom, neat and unused, the bed made up so tight you could have bounced a coin off it. The second was a bathroom. The third, at the end of the hall, was clearly Dorothy's room. The door was open a few inches, and the light was on inside like everywhere else. I pushed it open. The room was empty, but the bed was unmade, the covers thrown back like somebody had gotten up in a hurry. On the nightstand was a telephone, one of those old ones with the cord, and it had been knocked off the hook. The receiver was just hanging there by its cord, swinging a little, almost still, but not quite, like something had brushed past it, not long before. I stood in the doorway looking at that dangling phone, and I felt my mouth go dry. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as a routine call. An unmade bed, a phone off the hook, a hot meal downstairs, and no person anywhere. I keyed my radio to check in with dispatch, mostly just to hear another human voice. I told them the house was open, lights all on, food on the table, but no sign of the resident. The dispatcher, a woman named Carol, who I'd known for years, asked if I wanted backup out there. And I remember I paused before I answered, because part of me wanted to say yes, just to not be alone. But the nearest other unit was 40 minutes away, and I felt stupid asking someone to drive all that way because an old lady wasn't home. So I told Carol I'd finish clearing the house and check back in. I wish I'd said yes, because that was right around when I heard the first sound that didn't belong. It came from below me, from somewhere under the floor, from the basement. A soft, dragging sort of noise, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across a concrete floor. And then it stopped. I froze at the top of those stairs with my hand still on my radio, listening so hard my ears started ringing. For a long while there was nothing. Just that ticking clock and the wind outside working against the windows. I started to talk myself into believing I'd imagined it. Old houses settle. Pipes make noises. A raccoon could have gotten into the crawl space. I had a dozen reasonable explanations lined up before I'd even finished thinking the first one, because that's what your brain does when it doesn't want to accept what it just heard. But I'd been a cop long enough to know the difference between a house settling and something moving with intention. That dragging sound had a rhythm to it. Start, stop. It was the kind of noise a thing makes when it's carrying weight and has to pause to adjust. Its grip. I made my way back down the staircase slower than I'd gone up. My flashlight was in my left hand now, and my right had drifted to rest on my sidearm. Not drawing it, just holding the grip so I'd feel ready. The lights were still burning in every room, and it's strange, but all that brightness didn't make me feel any safer. If anything, it made things worse, because a lit-up house at night with nobody in it feels wrong in a way a dark one doesn't. Darkness, you expect. Light means somebody's supposed to be there. I ended up back in the hallway, standing in front of that basement door I'd skipped earlier. It was a plain wooden door, painted white like everything else, with a little metal latch instead of a proper handle. I put my ear close to it without touching it, and I heard breathing. I want to be careful here because I've had years to convince myself I made this up, and I still can't. It was breathing. Slow and thick and wet, coming from the other side of that door, from down at the bottom of the stairs. It wasn't the breathing of somebody in a panic. It was calm, patient. The sound a person makes when they're resting or when they're waiting. "Dorothy?" I said, and my own voice came out cracked. "Is that you down there?" The breathing stopped the instant I spoke. Just cut off completely, like whatever was making it had heard me and decided to go still. And that silence was so much worse than the sound had been, because now I knew that whatever was down there knew I was up here too. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to walk out the front door, get in my car, and drive. And I've asked myself 1,000 times why I didn't. The honest answer is that I had a job to do, and a missing woman who might be lying hurt at the bottom of those stairs, and I couldn't live with the idea of leaving her there because I got scared of a noise. So I made myself reach out and lift that latch. The door swung inward on its own weight, and a set of wooden stairs dropped away into the dark. This was the one part of the house where the light wasn't on. Down there was pure black, the kind your flashlight beam just seems to get swallowed by. Cold air came up out of that opening and rolled over me, and it carried a new smell, one that killed my appetite instantly. Under the roast beef and the baking, there was something sour and earthy, like turned soil, like the bottom of a hole in the ground. I pointed my light down the stairs. The beam showed me the first few steps, then a stretch of concrete floor, then a support post, and beyond that, nothing. I called out one more time, told whoever or whatever was down there that I was a police officer and I was coming down. My voice didn't sound like my own. I started descending one step at a time, testing each board before I put my full weight on it, keeping my back close to the wall so nothing could get behind me. Halfway down, my light caught something on the floor. A shoe. A woman's shoe, a plain tan loafer, lying on its side in the middle of the concrete. And a few feet past it, near the base of the support post, a smear. Dark and wide, trailing off into the part of the basement my beam couldn't reach. I'm not going to pretend I didn't know what it was. I'd seen enough by then to know blood when I saw it, even in bad light. That's when I heard the dragging sound again. Except this time it wasn't below me. This time it was behind me and above me, up in the house I'd just come down from. Something heavy was being pulled across the floor upstairs, moving toward the top of the basement stairs, moving toward the only way out. I spun around on that step so fast I nearly lost my footing. And I threw my light up toward the top of the stairs. There was nothing there, just the open doorway and the bright yellow light of the hallway spilling in from above. But the dragging kept going, slow and heavy, crossing the floor up there somewhere, just out of sight. And here's the thing that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. When I'd come down those stairs, I'd left that door wide open. I was staring right at it. And as I watched, it began to move. Not fast, not slammed. It just started to swing closed, slow and steady, like a hand I couldn't see was easing it shut, sealing me down there in the dark with whatever was bleeding on the floor behind me. I don't remember making a decision. I just went. I took those stairs 2 and 3 at a time, my flashlight beam swinging wild, across the walls, and I hit that door with my shoulder just before it latched. It flew back open, and I stumbled out into the hallway, breathing so hard my chest hurt, spinning in a circle with my light, and finally drawing my weapon, because I was long past caring whether I looked foolish. There was nothing in the hallway. The lights were still on. The house was still and quiet like I'd never left. But the dragging sound had stopped the second I came through that door, and now the silence had that same waiting quality it had before, thick and deliberate, like the whole place was watching me and biding its time. I keyed my radio again, and this time I didn't hesitate. I told Carol I needed backup immediately, that I had a possible homicide and something else going on that I couldn't explain, and to send whoever was closest right now. My voice must have told her more than my words did, because she didn't ask a single question. She just said units were coming and told me to get out of the house and wait in my vehicle. Good advice. I meant to take it. But as I was backing toward the front door with my weapon up and my eyes moving across every dark corner, I heard something that stopped me dead. It was a voice, a woman's voice, thin and frightened, and it was coming from the kitchen, from the room with the meal laid out that I'd already cleared and found empty. "Help me," it said. "Please, I'm in here. Please help me." Every part of my training told me to keep moving toward the door, but it was a woman's voice, and I was there for a woman, and what kind of person leaves somebody calling for help behind them just to save their own skin? So I turned toward the kitchen. I moved down that little stretch of hallway with my weapon leading the way, and I called out that I was coming, that I was a police officer, that she should keep talking so I could find her. "I'm in here," the voice said again. "Please hurry." I came around the corner into the kitchen. The table was still set. The food was still there, though it wasn't steaming anymore, and one of the chairs that had been empty was now pulled out from the table at an angle. But the room was empty. There was no woman in it, and the voice had sounded like it was standing 3 feet away from me, right on the other side of that doorway, and there was nobody there at all. Then it spoke again, and this time it came from behind me, from the hallway I'd just walked down. The exact same words, the exact same frightened tone. "Help me. Please, I'm in here." Word for word, note for note, like a recording being played back. And in that moment, I understood something that I have never been able to fully explain to myself since. Whatever was in that house wasn't asking for help. It was using those words the way a hunter uses a call, mimicking the one sound it knew would make me turn around and walk toward it instead of away. I didn't answer it. I didn't say anything at all. I turned around slow and I looked down that brightly lit hallway toward the front door. And standing between me and the way out, at the far end near the stairs, was a shape. I've spent years trying to describe that shape to myself, and I've never once gotten it right, so I'll just tell you what my eyes reported to me and let you make of it what you want. It was about the height of a person, standing near the bottom of the staircase where the hallway light should have shown me every detail. But it didn't. The light seemed to slide off it, like the brightness in that hall just refused to land on whatever it was. It had the general outline of somebody standing there, shoulders and a head and arms hanging down at the sides, but the proportions were wrong in a way I couldn't put my finger on. The arms hung too long, the head sat too low, and it didn't move at all. It just stood there in the one spot between me and the only door out of that house, perfectly still, while I aimed my weapon at it with hands that would not stop shaking. I told it to get on the ground. I told it to show me its hands. I said all the things you're trained to say, and my voice was steady even though the rest of me wasn't, and the shape did nothing. It didn't react to my voice at all. It just kept standing there, in that spilling yellow light that wouldn't touch it. And I got the overwhelming sense, the kind of knowing that comes from somewhere deeper than thought, that it was studying me, learning me, deciding. I don't know how long. We stood there facing each other. It felt like an hour. It was probably less than a minute. And then, off in the distance, faint but growing, I heard sirens. My backup, still miles out on that gravel road, but coming. And the instant I heard them, the shape at the end of the hall moved. Not toward me, it turned. Smooth and quick and wrong, no footsteps, no sound at all. And it went up the staircase in a way I can only describe as pouring, flowing up those steps and out of sight into the dark of the second floor. And the moment it was gone, every light in that house went out at once. Every single one. The whole place dropped into total blackness with me standing in the middle of it, and I ran. I ran for that front door with my flashlight bouncing off the walls, and I hit the porch, and I didn't stop until I was standing in the middle of the gravel driveway, under the open sky, gulping cold air, pointing my weapon back at the black shape of the house behind me. The other units arrived a few minutes later. 2 deputies from the neighboring county, guys I knew a little. They found me out there in the driveway. And I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost, because they didn't give me a hard time about it, which cops normally would. We cleared that house together, all 3 of us, and I'll tell you what we found and what we didn't. We found blood in the basement, a lot of it, along with that single tan shoe. We found the meal on the table, cold now and starting to draw flies. We found the phone off the hook in the bedroom and the unmade bed. What we did not find anywhere in that house or the woods around it was Dorothy. Not that night, not the next day when the state police came out with dogs, not ever. She was 71 years old, and she vanished off the face of the earth, and the official report says probable homicide. Suspect unknown. Body never recovered. Her daughter down in Ohio never got an answer. Nobody did. The part I never put in any report, the part I've kept to myself all these years, is the shape in the hallway and the voice in the kitchen and the light that wouldn't touch whatever stood at the bottom of those stairs. 'Cause what am I supposed to write? Who's going to sign off on that? I told my sergeant the lights had blown a fuse and I'd gotten spooked being alone, and he accepted it. And that was the end of it, as far as the department was concerned. But here's the thing that stayed with me the longest. The detail I think about when I can't sleep. The meal on that table was set for two. 2 plates, 2 chairs, 2 glasses of water. Dorothy lived alone. Her daughter was 500 miles away. There was no reason on earth for that table to be set for 2 people, unless she wasn't cooking for a person at all. Unless something had been living out there with her out at the end of that dark gravel road, and she'd been feeding it, keeping it, maybe trying to keep it satisfied so it would leave her be. And maybe one night that stopped being enough. I retired last spring, like I said. I never went back out to Coldwater Road, not once in all the years after, even though my patrols took me close by more times than I can count. The house sat empty, and eventually somebody tore it down. There's just a field out there now, and the woods behind it, and that same dark gravel that turns to ice when the cold comes in. I still don't lock my doors when I'm home alone. Locking them never felt like it would keep out the thing I'm actually afraid of, but I always keep the lights on. Story 2. People always ask me what the scariest call of my career was, and they expect me to say something about a shootout or a bad car wreck. Those things scared me, sure, but fear like that comes and goes. It spikes, and then it's over. What I'm about to tell you is different because it never really left. It's been sitting in the back of my head for going on 16 years now, and I still don't have a good explanation for it. I've mostly made my peace with that. Mostly. I did my policing down in a flat stretch of central Texas, a town small enough that everybody knew everybody, or thought they did. My name's Wade. I was a patrol officer for most of my career and never wanted to be anything else. Never wanted a desk. I liked being out on the roads at night, liked the quiet of it. Funny how that changes. This happened in August, which down there means heat, that doesn't quit even after the sun goes down. You could be standing outside at 11 at night and your shirt would still be sticking to your back. I was working a Tuesday overnight, and Tuesdays were about as dead as it got. I'd already done my loops around the closed-up downtown, checked the doors on the businesses, sat in a parking lot for a while just watching nothing happen. It was shaping up to be one of those shifts where the biggest event is deciding what to eat. A little after midnight, dispatch called me about a noise complaint. Now, noise complaints are the bottom of the barrel. Usually it's a party, or a dog, or 2 neighbors who hate each other, and I want the cops to referee. This one was a little different, though. The caller was an older man who lived out on a rural route, and he said there was some kind of sound coming from his neighbor's property that had been going on for hours, and he couldn't sleep through it. He described it as a low humming or moaning, and he said it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a machine, and he'd lived out there 30 years and never heard anything like it. The neighbor he was complaining about was a man named Perry, who lived alone on a good-sized piece of land at the end of the route. I knew the name a little. Perry kept to himself, didn't cause trouble. Wasn't the kind of person we ever got calls about. So I figured I'd swing by, see what the noise was, and probably find out it was a water pump gone bad or something equally dumb. I told dispatch I'd take it, and I pointed my car out toward the county line. The drive out there took a while. The roads got narrower and darker the farther I went, until it was just my headlights and the walls of dry corn on either side, standing dead still because there wasn't a breath of wind that night. Not one. I remember rolling my window down for a second, and the air outside was completely motionless, thick and warm, and quiet in a way that made me roll the window right back up. I couldn't have told you why. I just didn't like it. I found the complaining neighbor's house first, a little place with a porch light on, and the old man was standing out front waiting for me. He didn't want me to come inside. He just pointed across the field toward a dark shape of a house, maybe a quarter-mile off, and told me that's where it was coming from. I asked him if he could still hear it. He went quiet for a second, listening, and then he said no. It had stopped about 10 minutes ago, right around the time my headlights would have first come up the road. I asked him what he meant by that. He looked at me and said, real plain, that whatever it was, it went quiet when it saw me coming. Then he went back inside and shut his door, and I heard the lock turn. I sat in my car for a minute after the old man went inside, just looking across that dark field at Perry's place. There was something about the way he'd said it, that whatever was making the noise went quiet when it saw me coming, that stuck under my skin. It was a strange thing for a person to say. Most folks who call in a complaint want to tell you every detail, want you to agree with them that their neighbor's a nuisance. This man just pointed and went back in his house and locked up like he'd done his part and wanted nothing more to do with it. I pulled back out onto the road and drove down to Perry's driveway. It was a long dirt lane leading back off the road, and the house sat at the end of it. An old single-story farmhouse with a wide porch and a couple of outbuildings behind it. There wasn't a single light on anywhere. Not in the house, not on the porch, nothing. Just a dark shape against a slightly less dark sky. My headlights swept across the front of it as I pulled in, and I saw Perry's truck parked off to the side so somebody was home. I got out, and the heat wrapped around me right away, along with that same dead stillness. No crickets. That's a thing I noticed and didn't think much about at the time, but it comes back to me now. Out in the country in August, at midnight, the sound of insects is constant. It's a wall of noise you stop even hearing because it's always there. But standing in Perry's driveway, there was nothing. Total silence. It was like every living thing in that field had decided to hold still and keep quiet, and I was the only one who hadn't gotten the message. I walked up to the porch and called out for Perry. Said I was with the police department and I'd gotten a call about some noise and I just wanted to make sure everything was all right. My voice sounded too loud out there and all that quiet. Nothing answered me. I went up the porch steps and they held solid under me. No give to them. And I stood at the front door and tried again. Still nothing. The door was one of those old wooden ones with a window set into the top half, and the glass was dark. I put my flashlight up to it and looked through, and I could see a little bit of the front room. A couch, a chair, a coffee table with some stuff scattered on it. Ordinary. But as I was looking, my light landed on the far wall, and I saw the door to what must have been a hallway, and that door was open, and past it was just black. And I had the strangest feeling looking at that dark doorway that if I kept my light on it long enough, something was going to step into it and look back at me. I moved my beam away pretty quick. I tried the front door and it was locked. So I stepped back off the porch and started walking around the side of the house, sweeping my light across the ground and the walls, calling Perry's name every few steps. The side yard was overgrown, dry grass up past my ankles, and there was an old propane tank and some rusted junk that had been sitting there long enough for weeds to grow up through it. I came around to the back of the house, and that's where I found the source of the noise. Except it wasn't a noise anymore because it had stopped, just like the old man said. But I could see what had been making it, or at least I thought I could. Behind the house was a storm cellar, one of those old below-ground shelters with a pair of angled wooden doors set into a concrete frame, the kind of thing folks down there build to hide from tornadoes. And one of those doors was standing open, folded back flat against the ground, and the opening led down into the dark. There was a heavy chain and a padlock lying in the dirt next to it, and the chain had been cut, not rusted through, cut clean, with something strong. I stood there looking at that open cellar for a long moment, and while I was standing there, I heard the first real thing that made the hair on my neck stand up. From down inside that hole in the ground, way down at the bottom of it where my light couldn't reach, I heard a voice. It was low and rough, and it wasn't calling for help. It was singing, real soft, almost under its breath. Some slow tune I didn't recognize, just a person down in the dark singing quietly to themselves like they were passing the time. I called down and asked if that was Perry, if he was okay down there. The singing stopped. And then that same low voice said, real calm, "You should not have come out here tonight, officer." I'm not ashamed to say I took a step back from that cellar opening when the voice said that. There's a difference between somebody who's hurt or confused calling out to you and somebody who talks to you calm and steady from the bottom of a dark hole and tells you that you shouldn't have come. The first one you want to help. The second one makes every part of your body tell you to get back in your car. But I'd been doing the job long enough to keep my head, and I told myself it was just Perry, probably drunk, maybe having some kind of episode. And I needed to get him up out of there and figure out what was going on. So I keyed my radio and I called it in. I told dispatch I was out at Perry's place, that I'd found a cut lock on a storm cellar and somebody down inside it, and that the individual was talking but not making sense. I asked them to start another unit, my way. The dispatcher that night was a young guy named Cole, still pretty new, and he came back and said the nearest available unit was tied up on the other side of the county and it'd be at least 30 minutes. I told him to send them anyway. Then I turned back to the cellar. I called down again and told the man to come up where I could see him, that nobody was in trouble. I just needed to make sure he was all right. For a while, there was no answer. Then I heard movement down there, a slow shifting sound. And the voice came again, closer now, like he'd moved to the bottom of the stairs. "Perry's not down here anymore," it said. "Perry went and let me out, and now Perry's not down here." I want you to understand that I'd been on the job a long time by then. I'd dealt with people saying all kinds of crazy things. Folks on drugs, folks off their medication, folks who genuinely believed they were somebody else. So my mind went to those places first. The normal places. The places that made sense. I figured this was a man having a break of some kind, talking about himself in the third person. And the smart move was to keep him talking and to keep him calm until my backup showed up. I did not, at that point, believe there was anything down there but a sick and confused man. I want to be honest about that, because everything I felt later came from watching that belief fall apart. I asked him his name then, just to keep him talking, and the voice was quiet for a moment, like it was thinking about the question or like it was amused by it. Then it said it didn't have one anymore, that it used to have one a long time ago, but it had been down in the dark so long it had forgotten, and that Perry had been the one feeding it and keeping it company, and that Perry had made a mistake tonight, and it drew that last word out slow. That's about when I noticed the smell. It had been there the whole time, I think, but I'd been too focused to place it. It was coming up out of that cellar on the cool air, and because a hole in the ground stays cool even in August, and it was the smell of meat gone bad. Rot, thick and sweet and awful, the kind of smell that gets in the back of your throat and stays there. I'd smelled it before, at wrecks and at a couple of scenes I won't describe, and I knew exactly what it was. Something was dead down in that cellar, and it had been dead for a while. I made a decision then that I've gone back and forth on for 16 years. I decided I needed to see, because if Perry was down there hurt, or worse, I couldn't just stand up top and wait. So I got down at the edge of the opening, and I pointed my flashlight down the stairs all the way down, trying to light up the bottom of that cellar. The stairs went down maybe 10 or 12 steps to a concrete floor. My light found the bottom of them, and then it found the floor, and then it found what was lying on the floor. It was a man. He was on his back, with his arms out to the sides, and even from up top I could tell it was Perry, because I could see his face turn toward the light, his eyes open and dry and staring up at nothing. He'd been dead a while. His skin had that color to it. He was not the one who'd been talking to me. Because while my light was on Perry's body, the voice spoke again. And it came from the corner of the cellar, off to the side, out of the reach of my beam, from a patch of dark my light couldn't push into, no matter which way I moved it. "There he is," the voice said, soft and pleased. "You found him. Now come on down and keep us company." I pulled my light back up out of that hole so fast, I nearly fell over backward doing it. My heart was going hard enough that I could feel it in my ears. I was crouched at the edge of the cellar in the dark, and down below me was a dead man and a voice that wasn't his, coming from a corner my flashlight physically would not light up. I've thought about that part more than almost anything else. It wasn't that the corner was too far away. My beam reached the far wall fine. It was that the dark in that one spot just seemed thicker than it should be, like the light was going into it and not coming back out, and I could not make myself keep looking at it. I got up and I backed away from the opening, and I got on my radio again, and this time I didn't try to sound calm. I told Cole I had a confirmed dead body and a subject on scene who was not complying and who I could not see, and I needed every available unit, and I needed them now. Cole came back and his voice had changed because mine had, and he said he was pushing everybody he had toward me and to hold on. Then he asked me a question that I still remember word for word. He asked me if I was sure the subject was in the cellar with the body, and I said yes. Why? And he was quiet for a second, and then he said, "Real careful. That dispatch had just gotten a second call from that same address, from inside Perry's house, and the caller had hung up without saying anything." I turned around and looked at the house. The whole time I'd been out back at the cellar, that house had been dark, every window black, no porch light, nothing. But now, standing at the back of the property looking at it, I could see a light on inside, just one. A soft yellow glow coming from one window near the back, a window that would have been a kitchen or a back bedroom. It had not been on when I walked around the side of the house. I would have seen it, and there was no one else out there. Perry was dead at the bottom of a hole 10 feet from me. His truck was the only vehicle in the driveway. The old neighbor was a quarter-mile off, locked in his own house. There was nobody to have turned that light on. And the voice down in the cellar started laughing. Not loud, just a low, satisfied sort of laugh, like it was enjoying watching me put it together. And then it said, "You left the house without checking all the rooms, officer. That was careless. Somebody could have been inside the whole time. I need you to understand what that did to me. because it was right. I had looked in through the front door glass, and I had seen that dark hallway, and I had told myself the house was empty, and moved on to the cellar. I never cleared it. I never went inside. And this thing, this voice, at the bottom of a hole in the ground that I'd never taken my eyes off of for more than a few seconds, was describing what I'd done inside a house it could not possibly have seen me at. It knew I'd looked through the door. It knew I hadn't gone in. It was telling me about my own night like it had been standing right beside me the entire time. That was the moment I stopped being a police officer, processing a scene, and became a scared man standing alone in the dark. I started walking backward toward my car, keeping my flashlight moving between the cellar and the house, the two places I knew something was, and trying to watch both at once. And as I moved, the light in that back window went out, and a light in the next window over came on, and then that one went out, and the one next to it lit up. It was moving. Whatever was in that house was going room to room, and it was moving toward the front, toward the same side of the house I'd have to pass to get back to my car in the driveway. I made it to the corner of the house. My car was maybe 40 feet away, sitting in the driveway with its lights off. To get to it, I had to walk along the front of the house, right past that dark front porch and that door with the glass in it. I stood at the corner for a second, working up the nerve, telling myself it was 40 feet, just 40 feet. And then I'd be in the car with the doors locked. And from behind me, from all the way back at the cellar, the voice called out one more time, loud now, carrying across the still air. It said, "Better hurry. She's almost to the front door." I ran. I stopped thinking about clearing corners or doing anything by the book, and I just ran along the front of that house toward my car. And I made the mistake of looking at the front door as I passed it, because a person can't not look. And through the glass in that door, standing in the dark front room on the other side, there was a figure. I only saw it for the half second it took me to pass the porch, but I saw it. It was a woman, or it had the shape of one, standing very straight just inside the door with her face close to the glass, watching me go by. I couldn't make out her features. The room behind her was black, and her face was just a pale smear in it. But I could tell she was turned toward me, following me with her head as I passed, and she was standing in a house where the only other person for miles was dead in a hole out back. I got to my car, and I got the door open, and I threw myself in, and I hit the locks, and I sat there with both hands on the wheel, breathing like I'd run a mile. I looked back at the house. The front room was dark again. No figure in the door. No light in any window. It was just a black, empty farmhouse sitting quiet in a field, the way it had looked when I first pulled up, like none of it had happened. But I'd seen her. I know I saw her. I started the car, and I backed down that long dirt lane instead of turning around, because I did not want to take my eyes off that house, and I sat at the end of the driveway with my headlights pointed at it, and my doors locked, and I waited for my backup. It took them another 15 minutes to get there. Those were the longest 15 minutes of my life. The whole time, nothing moved in that house. No lights, no figures, no sound. But I had the constant feeling of being watched. That same feeling you get when someone's staring at the back of your head, except it was coming from every dark window at once. When the other units finally rolled up, 3 cars of them, I climbed out, and I could barely get the words out to explain what was going on. They looked at me like I'd lost it, and I don't blame them. We went in together, all 4 of us, weapons out, lights everywhere. We cleared that house room by room, every closet, every corner. It was empty, bone empty. There was no woman. There was no sign anybody but Perry had lived there. No women's clothes, no second toothbrush, nothing. Just an old man's lonely little house. We went out to the cellar. Perry was down there, dead exactly like I'd seen him. The medical examiner said later he'd been gone at least 2 days, maybe 3. Which is a thing I still can't square, because that voice had talked to me for a solid 20 minutes, and it had used Perry's mouth to do it, or so I'd assumed, and Perry had been dead for days. When we went down into that cellar with all our lights, there was nobody in the corner. There was nobody down there at all but Perry's body. But my flashlight worked fine on that corner then. Lit it right up. Whatever had made the dark thicker was gone. The cut chain and the padlock were real, and they went into evidence, and nobody ever explained who cut them or why. The case got written up as a death investigation, natural causes eventually. An old man with a bad heart who died alone in his storm cellar. There was no mention of a voice, or a woman in the window, or lights going room to room, because I never put any of that in my report. I told them what could be proven, and I kept the rest to myself. And I've kept it to myself ever since. Except for right now. Here's the thing that I've never been able to let go of. The old neighbor, the one who called it in, I went and talked to him a few days later, on my own time, because I needed to know if he'd seen anything I could hang on to. Anything that made me feel less crazy. And he told me that Perry hadn't always lived alone. That years back, there'd been a woman out there with him, a wife or a girlfriend. Nobody was quite sure. And that she'd disappeared one summer, and Perry had told everybody she'd left him and gone back east. And that after she was gone, Perry started spending more and more time out at that storm cellar, and folks would hear him out there at night, talking to somebody, keeping somebody company. The old man said he'd always figured Perry just went strange from being lonely. But I think about that cut chain, a chain that was cut from the outside to let something out. On the same night, Perry finally turned up dead. And I think about that voice telling me Perry had let it out, and that Perry had made a mistake. And I think about a woman standing in the window of an empty house, watching me run. I retired from the department a few years back. I moved into town, into a place with neighbors close on both sides, streetlights out front, no fields anywhere near. People think I moved for my wife, to be closer to the grandkids, and that's part of it. But the truth is, I can't stand the country at night anymore. That much dark, that much quiet, that much space for something to be standing just past where your light reaches. I did my 30 years out on those dark roads, and I loved every one of them until that Tuesday in August. Now I keep to where it's bright, and where I can hear other people through the walls, and where I never have to wonder what might be waiting at the bottom of a hole in the ground, singing softly to itself in the dark, hoping somebody careless comes along to keep it company. Story 3. There's a rule they don't teach you at the academy, but every officer figures it out on their own eventually. Some places want you to leave. You walk into a house, or a building, or a stretch of woods, and before you've done anything at all, something in you says, turn around and go. Most of the time it's nothing. Your gut being jumpy. But once in a while it's the only warning you're going to get, and if you ignore it, you spend the rest of your life wishing you hadn't. I ignored mine one time. I want to tell you about it. I go by Reed. I worked patrol for about 14 years up in the mountains of western Colorado, small resort town department. The kind of place that's packed with tourists in ski season and empty as a graveyard the rest of the year. This happened in the empty part. Late March, right after the last of the tourists had cleared out, and before the summer crowd showed up. The town felt hollow that time of year. Half the businesses closed. Whole streets of vacation rentals sitting dark and locked up, waiting for June. It was those vacation rentals that got me into this. We had a lot of them, big expensive cabins up in the hills that people from out of state owned and rented out during the busy seasons. In the off months, they mostly sat empty. And part of our job was keeping an eye on them because empty houses full of nice things are a magnet for break-ins. So it wasn't unusual for the property management companies to call us when something seemed off at one of their places. This particular call came in around 10 at night. A management company had gotten an alarm notification from one of their cabins up on a road called Elkhorn Rise, way up at the top of a switchback that dead-ended in the trees. The alarm company couldn't reach the owners, and the management company couldn't send anybody up there that late, so they asked us to go check it. Probably a false alarm, they said. The wind up there set those sensors off all the time. They just needed somebody to lay eyes on it and make sure nobody had broken in. I took the call because I was closest and because, honestly, I liked driving those mountain roads at night when there was no traffic. It was peaceful. I headed up the switchbacks with my windows cracked, and the higher I got, the more snow was still hanging on in the trees. Old, dirty spring snow that hadn't melted off up at that elevation. The road got rougher near the top, more gravel than pavement. And then it just ended at a wide spot in front of the cabin. It was a big place. 2 stories, all dark wood and river stone, the kind of house that costs more than I'd make in a decade. Every window was black. The management company had told me the owners were back in Chicago and the place should be empty. No renters booked until the summer. So I was expecting an empty house. That's what I got, more or less. But the second I pulled into that clearing and my headlights hit the front of the cabin, I got the feeling I was talking about. The one that says leave. I want to be clear that nothing was wrong that I could see. The doors were shut. The windows weren't broken. There were no cars, no footprints in the snow patches, no sign anybody was around. It was just a big, dark, empty house at the end of a dead-end road, exactly like I'd been told to expect. But sitting there in my car looking at it, I did not want to get out. I've been doing this long enough to usually trust that feeling. And every part of me wanted to key my radio and say false alarm, all clear, and drive back down the mountain. But I could see from where I was parked that the front door was open. Not wide, just a few inches, enough that I could tell it wasn't shut all the way. And an open door on a house that's supposed to be empty is the one thing you can't drive away from. So I turned off my engine, and I got out, and I have wished 1,000 times since that I hadn't. The first thing that hit me when I stepped out of the car was how quiet it was up there. I mentioned the town felt hollow that time of year, but up at the top of that switchback it was something past quiet. There was no wind, even though the management company had blamed the alarm on wind. The trees around the clearing were dead still. No birds, no animals moving in the brush, none of the little sounds you get used to hearing in the mountains even at night. It was like standing inside a photograph. My own boots crunching on the gravel were the loudest thing for miles, and I found myself walking softer without deciding to, the way you do when you don't want to be noticed. I got my flashlight out, and I swept it across the front of the cabin as I walked up. Big picture windows on the ground floor, all of them dark. The glass throwing my light right back at me so I couldn't see much inside. A wide, covered porch. That front door standing open those few inches, with nothing but black on the other side of the gap. I called out as I came up the steps, announced myself, said I was with the police, and I was responding to an alarm, and was anybody inside. My voice went out into all that stillness, and just died. No echo, no answer, nothing. I got up to the door, and I pushed it open the rest of the way with the back of my hand, keeping my flashlight up. It swung in smooth and quiet, well-oiled, No complaint from the hinges. And my light went into the front room of that cabin, and I stood in the doorway and looked, and everything in there was normal. That's the part that's hard to explain to people. There was nothing wrong with the room. It was a big open living space with leather furniture and a stone fireplace and a staircase going up to the second floor, all of it clean and neat and expensive, exactly the way a high-end rental cabin looks between guests. There was no mess, no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, nothing knocked over. If somebody had broken in, they'd been the tidiest burglar in history. I stepped inside. The air in there was cold, colder than outside almost, and it had a strange staleness to it, like the house had been sealed up a long time, even though the door had been standing open. I called out again and moved my light around the room, checking corners. And that's when I noticed the first thing that was actually off, though it took me a second to understand what I was looking at. There was a fire going in the fireplace, not a big one. Just some low coals and a couple of small flames. The kind of fire that's mostly burned down. But it was a live fire, giving off a little heat and a little light, in a house that was supposed to be empty, at the end of a road with no cars and no footprints in the snow. Somebody had built that fire. And a fire like that, burned down to coals but still going, meant somebody had built it within the last few hours. They hadn't come by car, or I'd have seen tire tracks. They hadn't walked in across the snow, or I'd have seen prints. But they'd been here, in this house, tonight, close enough to now that their fire was still warm. I stood very still, and I listened. And in the quiet of that house, I started to hear something I hadn't heard from outside. It was faint, coming from upstairs, and at first I couldn't place it. It was a soft, rhythmic sort of sound, slow and steady, going on and on without a break. It took me a while to figure out what it reminded me of. And when I did, I didn't like it at all. It sounded like somebody rocking, like the runners of a rocking chair going back and forth on a wood floor, slow and patient, the way somebody rocks a baby to sleep, or the way somebody rocks when they're sitting alone in the dark with nothing else to do. I got on my radio and I called it in low, almost whispering. I told dispatch I was inside the cabin on Elkhorn Rise, that the door had been opened, that there was a fire recently lit in the fireplace and what sounded like a person upstairs, and that the residence was supposed to be unoccupied. The dispatcher that night was a woman named Beth, and she asked if I wanted to wait for backup before going up. And I stood there at the bottom of that staircase, listening to that slow rocking going back and forth above my head, and I told her yes. I told her I'd hold the ground floor and wait, because that feeling from outside was back, stronger now, and it was telling me not to go up those stairs. Then the rocking stopped, and a voice came down from the top of the stairs, a woman's voice, soft and friendly, and it said, "Is that you, honey? I've been waiting up for you. Come on up, I kept the bed warm." I did not answer that voice. I want to tell you exactly why, because it matters. It wasn't just that a strange woman was talking to me from the dark at the top of a staircase in a house that was supposed to be empty. It was the way she said it. She called me honey, and she said she'd been waiting up for me, and she said she kept the bed warm, like she knew me, like she'd been expecting me, specifically, sitting up there rocking in the dark, waiting for me to walk through that door. And I had never been to that cabin before in my life. Nobody knew I was coming up there, except dispatch, and I hadn't known it myself until an hour before, so I stayed quiet, and I moved back away from the staircase, keeping my flashlight and my eyes pointed up toward the top of it. And Beth was still on the radio, and she'd heard the voice come through, faint. And she asked me quiet whether there was somebody with me. I keyed the mic and I told her yes. There was a female subject upstairs, and I needed backup rolling now. She said she was sending somebody, but I already knew what she was going to say next, and she said it. The nearest unit was down in town, and town was a good 25 minutes down those switchbacks in the dark. I told her to have them come anyway, fast as was safe, and I'd try to keep the situation calm until they got there. Then the voice came again from upstairs, still soft, still friendly, but there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there the first time. A little edge. It said, "Don't be shy. You came all this way to see me. It's rude to stand down there and not even say hello. I'm going to be straight with you about my thinking in that moment, because I've turned it over so many times. My training said there was a person up there, probably a squatter, maybe somebody with mental problems who'd broken in and was living in this empty cabin and had built themselves a fire to stay warm. That's a real thing that happens, especially in a resort town full of empty houses. Confused people find their way into them. So the reasonable read was that this was a woman who was not well, who thought I was somebody else, and that I needed to talk her down gently and get her out safe. That's what I told myself. But there was another part of me, that older animal part I've mentioned, and that part was not buying it. Because a confused squatter doesn't call down the exact right things to make you come up the stairs. A confused squatter doesn't wait in the dark without a light of her own. And when I really listened to that voice, it didn't sound confused at all. It sounded like it knew exactly what it was doing. I decided I'd try talking. I called up and told her I was a police officer, that I wasn't who she thought I was, and that I needed her to come down the stairs slowly with her hands where I could see them so we could sort things out. I kept my voice level and easy the way you're trained to. And there was a long silence after I said it, a really long one. The fire behind me settled a little, one of the coals shifting, and that was the only sound in the whole house. And then the voice spoke again, and it had changed completely. The softness was gone. It was flat now and cold, and it said, "You're not him." Just that. "You're not him." And then, after another pause, it said, "He always comes when I call. 14 years, he's always come. Who are you in my house telling me what to do? 14 years. That number went through me like cold water. Because I'd been on the job 14 years, and I know that's a coincidence. But standing there in that freezing dark house did not feel like one. And more than the number, it was that she'd said her house. This cabin belonged to some couple in Chicago who rented it out to skiers. It was not anybody's house, not really. And it sure wasn't the house of a woman who'd been waiting 14 years for a man to come up the stairs to her. I started backing toward the front door. I'd decided. Whatever was up there, whoever she was, I was not going to stand in that house alone with her for 25 minutes waiting for backup. I'd wait outside, in my car, with the doors locked and my headlights on the front door where I could see anybody who came out. That was the smart move, and I should have made it the second I heard the rocking. So I backed toward the door, watching the stairs the whole way, and behind me, from the direction of the front door I was backing toward, in a spot I'd already cleared, a second voice said, very quietly, right at the level of my ear, "Where do you think you're going?" I came around fast and put my light and my hand toward that second voice, and there was nothing there. The front door was where it had been, standing open to the black outside. The entryway was empty. But that voice had been close, not across the room close. It had been right behind me, right at my shoulder, close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck. And it had not been the woman's voice from upstairs. It was lower. It sounded like a man. And now I had a woman I couldn't see at the top of the stairs, and a man I couldn't see somewhere between me and the only door out, and I was standing in the middle of that big, cold room with my back to nothing safe, turning in a slow circle with my flashlight, trying to watch everything at once and failing. I keyed my radio, and I didn't bother keeping my voice down anymore. I told Beth I now had at least 2 subjects in the residence, that I could hear them but could not see either one, and I asked her for the closest unit status. She came back and told me the unit was on the switchbacks, maybe 15 minutes out. 15 minutes. And then Beth, who I'd worked with for years and who had a steady head, said something in a voice I'd never heard her use before. She asked me, real careful, whether I was certain there was anybody in the house at all. Because, she said, the alarm company had just called back. They'd pulled the sensor history for the cabin, and, according to their records, the only door or window that had opened on that property in the last 6 months was the front door. Tonight, when I opened it, I want you to sit with that the way I had to. The management company told me the owners were in Chicago and there were no renters. The alarm history said nothing had opened up there in half a year. No doors, no windows, until I pushed that front door open myself. But there was a fire burning in the fireplace, built within the last few hours. There was a woman upstairs who'd been rocking in the dark, waiting for a man who always came when she called. There was a second voice at my shoulder. None of them could have gotten into that sealed house without opening a single door or window in 6 months. And yet they were there. I could hear them. I was standing in a room with them. That's the moment the fear stopped being about a person who might hurt me and became something else. Something I didn't have a name for and still don't. Because a squatter, I understood. A burglar, I understood. But whatever was in that house with me had not come in through any door. Up at the top of the stairs, the woman started rocking again. I could hear the slow runners going back and forth on the wood. And she started humming along with it, low and tuneless, a sound with no song in it, just up and down, in time with the rocking. And the man's voice, from somewhere in the dark near the door, said, gentle as anything. She gets upset when her visitor won't come up. You don't want to make her upset. It's better up there than down here. Go on up. I made for the door. I didn't back toward it this time. I turned and I went 3 quick steps across that room toward the open front door and the cold night and my car sitting out there in the clearing. And when I was almost to it, the door swung shut. Not thrown, not slammed. It just came around slow and smooth on those well-oiled hinges and settled into the frame. And I heard the mechanism inside it turn over and lock. A house that had recorded nothing opening in 6 months had just closed and locked its own front door with me on the wrong side of it. I grabbed the handle, and it would not move. I could see in my flashlight beam that the deadbolt was thrown. I reached up to turn it, and my fingers touched the little knob of the bolt, and it was ice cold. Cold enough that it stung, and it would not turn. It was like it had frozen solid in place. Behind me, the rocking got faster. The humming got louder. And the man's voice, right at my ear again now, close enough that I flinched away from it, said, almost kind, almost sad, you should have just gone up. Now you made her come down. And upstairs, the rocking stopped. And I heard, from the top of the staircase, the first slow step of something starting to come down. I didn't wait to see what was coming down those stairs. There was a big picture window off to the side of the front room, one of the ones that had thrown my light back at me when I first walked up. And I put my flashlight in my offhand and I went at that window with everything I had. I'm a big guy, and I hit it with my shoulder, and my forearm up to protect my face, and the glass gave. It didn't shatter clean the way it looks in movies. It cracked and buckled, and I went through it in a mess of broken pieces and cold air. And I landed hard on the porch outside on my hands and knees, and I felt the glass cut me up along my arm. And I did not care one bit. I was outside. I got up and I ran for my car, and I did not look back at the house, not once, because I could hear behind me, through the broken window, the sound of that slow, steady step still coming down the stairs, one at a time, like whatever it was had all the time in the world. I got in my car and I locked it and I started it, and I got it turned around on that gravel, and I went down those switchbacks faster than I had any business going in the dark, tires sliding on the loose spots, my heart going like a hammer the whole way. About halfway down, I met the backup unit coming up, a younger officer named Trent. And I flashed my lights, and we both stopped, and I told him through the window, breathing hard and bleeding down my arm, that we were not going back up there without more people and more light, and probably not even then. He looked at me like he didn't know what to make of me, the senior officer he respected, cut up and shaking and refusing to go back to a scene. But he'd known me long enough to take it seriously, and we both sat there on that switchback with our engines running until 2 more units and a supervisor made it up the mountain. There were 5 of us when we finally went back up to that cabin, near an hour later, with every light we had and the sun starting to think about coming up behind the peaks. And I'll tell you what we found and what we didn't. We found the broken window where I'd gone through it, glass all over the porch, my blood on the sill. That was real. That happened, and there was proof of it. We found the front door, and it was locked, deadbolt thrown, exactly like it had been when I couldn't turn it. But when Trent reached up and turned that bolt, it turned easy, no ice, no resistance, and the door opened right up. Inside, the house was empty. Not just no people, empty. It was cold and dead and stale, and the fireplace was full of nothing but old gray ash, dead ash, cold all the way through, the kind that's been sitting untouched for weeks or months. There was no fire. There were no coals. There was no warmth coming off it at all. But I had stood 10 feet from that fireplace and felt the heat of a live fire on my face, maybe an hour before. 5 of us checked every room in that cabin, every closet, under every bed, the whole second floor. There was no woman. There was no rocking chair anywhere in the house. Not one, not in any room. Nothing with runners on it that could have made the sound I'd heard going back and forth over my head for 20 minutes. The beds were made up flat and tight and cold. Nobody had been in any of them. Nobody had been in that house at all. The management company never could explain the alarm that started the whole thing, other than to say the wind, and there'd been no wind. The report got written up as a false alarm, and a broken window, property damage, officer injured on scene, and my supervisor was decent enough to log my version of events without pushing me on the parts that didn't make sense, which was most of them. I got 7 stitches in my arm. I've still got the scar. Some nights I look at it, and it's the only thing that convinces me I didn't dream the whole night, because everything else about it came apart the moment other people showed up, the way these things do. I did some quiet digging afterward on my own, the way you do when a thing won't let you sleep. That cabin on Elkhorn Rise had been built about 20 years back, and the people in Chicago were the 3rd owners. The first family that built it and lived in it year-round before it ever became a rental had been a husband and wife. And the story around town, the kind of story old-timers tell you in a low voice, was that the husband used to work long hours down the valley and drive up that switchback late at night. And one winter, he went off the road on the way home in the dark and died down in the trees. And his body wasn't found until the snow melted that spring. And that his wife stayed up in that cabin alone for years after. And folks said she never really accepted he was gone. That she'd sit up every night waiting for him to come home, waiting for him to come up the stairs, and that she'd rock, and she'd wait, and she'd keep the bed warm, right up until the night she died up there too, alone, still waiting. 14 years, the voice said. I don't know if that's how long she waited. I've never been able to find out for sure, and part of me doesn't want to. I put in for a transfer to the Valley Station about 6 months later, and I finished out my career down where the roads are flat and the houses are close together. I never took another call up on Elkhorn Rise, and I never will because I'm retired now, and that cabin is somebody else's problem. But I'll tell you the one thing I think about most. The thing I've never been able to shake. That second voice, the man's voice, the one at my shoulder. The one that told me she gets upset when her visitor won't come up. The one that told me it was better up there than down here. He'd been waiting a long time to come home too. And I think that night, for a little while, he thought I was him. And I think when she came down those stairs, she was coming down to meet the husband she'd been waiting 14 years for. And I got out a window and left her to come down to an empty room, still waiting, the way she has been all along and maybe always will be. Story 4. I kept a journal my whole time on the force. Nothing fancy, just a spiral notebook I jot the day's calls in when I got home, mostly so the shifts wouldn't all blur together the way they do after a while. I've got a whole box of those notebooks in my closet, and there's exactly one night in all of them where I wrote down the calls, the way I always did, and then at the bottom of the page I wrote 3 more words that I never explained to anybody, and never crossed out, and still can't fully make sense of when I read them back. The words were, "Don't go back." I'm going to tell you about the night I wrote that. Call me Shane. I spent about 9 years as a deputy in a rural county down in southern Louisiana, bayou country, the kind of place where the land and the water don't have a clear agreement about which is which. Flat, wet, hot, and old. Real old. There were parts of my county where people had been living the same way for 200 years, and there were parts where nobody lived at all and nobody wanted to. This is about one of those empty parts. It was the middle of summer, deep into July, and if you've never spent a July night in South Louisiana, I don't know how to make you understand it. The heat doesn't leave when the sun does. The air just sits on you, thick and wet, full of the sound of frogs and insects, so loud it becomes a kind of silence because you stop hearing it. That's how the night started, loud with all that living noise the way it always was. I was working the graveyard shift, running the back roads, and around 2 in the morning I got a call from dispatch that didn't make a lot of sense at first. They'd received a 911 call from a landline out at an address on Bellinger Road, which surprised me because as far as I knew there was nothing out on Bellinger Road. It was a dead-end dirt track that ran back into the swamp, past a couple of old abandoned properties, and it didn't go anywhere. I'd driven it maybe twice in 9 years, both times looking for dumped stolen cars. There wasn't a working phone line back there that I knew of. But dispatch had a call from that address. And here's the thing that made the hair on my arms move even before I left the station. The call had come in, connected, and then there'd been no voice on the other end, just an open line. The dispatcher, an older woman named Rhonda, who had been doing that job longer than I'd been alive, said she could hear something on the line, but it wasn't talking. She said it sounded like breathing, but slow and far away from the phone, like the receiver was sitting on a table across the room from whoever was breathing. She stayed on the line and kept asking if anybody needed help, and nobody ever answered, and eventually the line went dead, So she was sending me to check on it, because that's what you do, even when the address is a place where nobody's supposed to be. I remember I sat in my car for a second after I got the call, just outside the station, with the engine running and the AC going, because I knew that road, and I knew there weren't any working houses back there. And I could not figure out where a landline call would come from. And a part of me, even that early, already didn't want to go. But it was my county, and it was my shift, and a 911 call is a 911 call. So I put it in gear, and I headed out toward Bellinger Road, with the frogs screaming in the dark on both sides of me the whole way. The drive out took the better part of half an hour, and the closer I got to that dead-end road, the more I noticed something that I told myself at the time was just my imagination. The frogs and the insects. That wall of noise that's always there on a summer night down there, that never stops. It was getting quieter. Not all at once, just fading, mile by mile, until by the time I turned onto the dirt of Bellinger Road, it had stopped completely. Total silence. In July, in the swamp. And in 9 years, I had never once heard that swamp go quiet. I want to explain what that silence did to me, because if you haven't lived somewhere like that, you can't know. Down in the bayou, the night noise is a comfort. It's the sound of a world full of living things going about their business, and you stop hearing it the same way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. But when it stops, when it truly stops, every animal within earshot going still and quiet at the same time, that's a signal. Animals go quiet when there's a predator around. When something bigger and meaner than them has come into the area, and they're all holding still and hoping it passes them by. I'd heard the swamp go partly quiet before, in patches, when a gator was moving or a big owl was hunting. I had never heard the whole thing shut off at once like somebody had thrown a switch. I rolled down my window as I drove up that dirt track, just to be sure I wasn't imagining it. The hot, wet air came in, and with it, nothing. No frogs, no insects, not the smallest sound of anything alive. Just my tires moving slow over the dirt and my own engine. I rolled the window back up. I turned my radio down low, though I couldn't have told you why, except that the quiet felt like something you weren't supposed to disturb. Bellinger Road ran back maybe a mile through the trees before it dead-ended. I passed the first abandoned property on the left, an old collapsed shack that had been falling into the swamp for decades. Nothing but a black shape of leaning boards in my headlights. I passed the second one, which was in even worse shape, barely a pile, and I kept going, because the address dispatch had given me was at the very end, the last one on the road. A place I honestly couldn't remember ever seeing. And when I came around the last bend and my headlights swung across the end of that road, there was a house there. Now, I'd driven this road twice before, and I'll be honest with you, I did not remember a standing house at the end of it. I remembered the two collapsed ones. I remembered the road just petering out into swamp. But there it was, a real house. A raised Acadian-style place up on brick piers, the way they build them down there to stay above the water, with a porch across the front and a steep tin roof. It wasn't in good shape. The paint was long gone and the wood had gone gray and some of the porch was sagging. But it was standing, and it was whole, and there was a soft light showing in one of the front windows. A dim, warm yellow light like a single lamp or an oil lantern turned down low. A light in a window at the end of a dead-end road in the swamp, at an address where a 911 call had come from that nobody spoke on. in the middle of a silence so complete, it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. I stopped my car a good distance back from the house, and I sat there looking at it. And I did something I almost never did on a call. I got on the radio and I told Rhonda I'd found a house at the address occupied with a light on. And I asked her to confirm the address one more time because I wanted to be sure I was in the right place. She read it back to me. Same address. And then she went quiet for a second, and she asked me in a voice that wasn't quite her usual steady dispatcher voice whether everything was all right out there. I told her I didn't know yet, and she said, "Be careful, Shane." And there was something in how she said my name that I didn't like, because Rhonda had sent me on 1,000 calls, and she'd never once told me to be careful. I got out of the car. The heat wrapped around me, and the silence pressed in, and I walked up toward that house with my flashlight in my hand, even though the light in the window meant I probably wouldn't need it. I called out as I got close. Said I was with the sheriff's office, that we'd gotten a call from this address, and was anybody home, and did they need help. My voice went out into that dead quiet and just stopped. No echo. Swallowed up. And nobody answered. I got to the bottom of the porch steps, and I stopped, because I could see the front door now, and it was standing wide open. And through it, past the doorway, I could see part of a front room lit by that soft yellow light. And in the middle of that room, facing away from me, facing the far wall, there was a person sitting in a chair, perfectly still, not moving at all. Just sitting there in the lamplight with their back to the open door, in a house at the end of a road that I was no longer sure had been there the last time I drove it. I stood at the bottom of those steps for what felt like a long time, looking at the back of that person in the chair. My training told me a dozen ordinary things. Somebody old and hard of hearing who couldn't make out my voice. Somebody asleep. Somebody who'd had a medical emergency. A stroke maybe, and couldn't respond, which would explain the 911 call with no voice on it. All of those were reasonable, and I ran through every one of them. Standing there in the dark, because your mind reaches for reasonable when it's staring at something that isn't. But there was a problem with all of my reasonable explanations, and the problem was that the person in the chair was too still. A sleeping person shifts. A sick person slumps or twitches or breathes in a way you can see. This person sat straight up in the chair, hands resting on the arms of it, head level, facing the far wall, and did not move at all. Not the smallest bit. It was the stillness of something that had decided to be still. I called out again, louder, and I put a little more edge in it, the command voice. I said I needed them to let me know they were okay, to raise a hand or say a word. Nothing. The figure sat there in the lamplight. And now that I was closer and looking harder, I could see it was a man. An old man by the look of the thin white hair on the back of his head, wearing an old-fashioned kind of shirt, the sleeves rolled up. Just sitting, facing the wall. I went up the steps. I'll admit my hand was on my weapon now, resting on the grip, because everything about that house had my nerves stretched wire-tight, even though nothing had actually happened. The porch boards held under me, solid, no give, no sound. I got to the open doorway, and I stopped just outside it, and I looked into that room properly for the first time. It was an old room, furnished old, the way a house looks when nobody's updated anything in 50 years. There was a lamp on a side table, an oil lamp, and that was the light, turned down low. There was a rug worn thin, and some framed pictures on the walls too far and dim to make out. And the old man in his chair in the middle of it all, facing away from me toward that far wall. And here's the thing I noticed then that started to unravel me. There was nothing on that far wall. He was sitting there, bolt upright, staring at a blank stretch of gray wall with nothing on it. No window, no picture, no clock. Just wall. He'd positioned his chair to face an empty piece of wall, and he was sitting there looking at it in the middle of the night. I stepped into the doorway, into the room, and I said gently now, "Sir, my name's Shane. I'm a deputy. I'm going to come around where you can see me, all right? I don't want to startle you." And I started to move around the side of the room in a wide arc so I could come around to the front of that chair and see his face without getting right up on him. And as I moved, I kept my eyes on him. And he did not track me, did not turn his head, did not react to my voice or my movement at all. He just kept facing that blank wall. I got about halfway around. And that's when I heard it. And it stopped me cold with one foot still in the air. From the man in the chair, low and steady, came a sound. He was talking, very quietly, under his breath, in a low mutter I hadn't been able to hear from the doorway. I couldn't make out words at first. It was just a soft, running murmur, on and on, the same low tone like a man praying, or like a man repeating something he'd said so many times it had worn smooth. I stood still and I listened, and slowly the sound started to resolve into words. And when I understood what he was saying, the sweat on my back went cold in that hot room. He was saying over and over, in that flat, quiet mutter, "Don't turn around. Don't turn around. Don't turn around." I stood frozen, half crouched, at the side of that room, and the old man kept muttering it to the blank wall. "Don't turn around. Don't turn around." And I understood, in a slow, sick way, that he was not saying it to himself. He was saying it to me. He knew I was there. He'd known the whole time. And he was facing that wall on purpose and telling me, "Please, don't turn around." And behind me, from the direction of the open front door I'd come through, the door I'd left wide open to the night, something moved, not loud, just the smallest shift of weight on the porch boards, out there in the dark behind me. The exact same boards that had held solid and silent under my own feet a minute before. Everything in my body wanted to turn toward that sound on the porch. That's the instinct, right? Something moves behind you, you turn and face it. 9 years of training on top of a lifetime of being an animal that doesn't want to be caught from behind, all of it screaming at me to spin around and put my eyes and my weapon on whatever was out there. And the only thing that stopped me, the only thing, was that old man in the chair, still muttering, low and steady and desperate. "Don't turn around. Don't turn around." He'd said it before I ever heard the porch move. He'd known it was coming, and some part of me decided, in a half a second, that a man who was sitting in the dark, facing a blank wall, repeating that warning, had probably learned it the hard way, and that I should listen to him. So I didn't turn around. I stood there, half-crouched, staring at the side wall, at the dim-framed pictures I still couldn't make out, and I did not turn to face the door. And behind me, the weight on the porch shifted again, closer, and then I heard it come across the threshold, into the house, into the room with me. There was no footstep sound exactly, nothing so clean as that. It was more like a slow settling, a pressure, the sense of something large easing its way into the space behind my back, taking up room in the air. And with it came a smell, rolling in on the still hot air, and it was the smell of deep swamp water, of black mud and rot and things that have been under the surface a long, long time. It was the smell of the bottom of the bayou, and it was standing in the room behind me. The old man's muttering never stopped, but it changed. It got faster, more urgent. "Don't turn around, don't turn around. running the words together now, and under it I could hear his breath coming quicker. And I realized the old man was terrified. He'd been sitting in that chair, terrified maybe for a very long time, facing that wall, not daring to turn. And the reason there was no light on that far wall and nothing to look at was that the wall was the only safe direction. The only place you could point your eyes where you wouldn't see it. I keyed my radio. I did it slow, my hand moving careful, and I kept my voice down to almost nothing. And I told Rhonda I needed help immediately, that there was a subject in the house and something else, and I couldn't explain it, and there wasn't time. Just send everybody. And Rhonda's voice came back through my earpiece, low, and she said units were coming. And then she said something that I have never forgotten, in a voice gone thin and strange. She said, "Shane, whatever's out there with you, do not look at it. You hear me? Don't you look at it." Rhonda, who'd worked that radio for 40 years. Like she knew, like this wasn't the first time a call had come from the end of Bellinger Road, and she'd learned, same as the old man, what happens if you turn around. The thing behind me came closer. I could feel it now, the way you can feel a person standing right behind you even with your eyes shut. That pressure on the back of your neck, except this was bigger than a person, and colder, and the swamp water smell of it was so thick I could taste it. And then it spoke. Right behind my head, low and wet and slow, in a voice that sounded like it was coming up through water, it said my name. It said, Shane. Just my name. And I had never told it my name. I told the old man. I told Rhonda over the radio. I had not said my name out loud to the dark, and the dark knew it anyway. It said my name again, softer, almost coaxing, the way you'd call a dog you wanted to come close. "Shane, look at me." And that was the pull of it. That was the danger, because there was something in that voice that made me want to. Made turning around feel like the most natural thing in the world. Like it would be rude not to. Like, of course, I should turn and look at whoever was speaking to me so politely by name. My head actually started to move. I felt my chin start to come around toward my shoulder, my body betraying me, wanting to obey that voice. And the old man in the chair screamed. He broke out of his muttering, and he screamed one word, loud enough to crack, and the word was no. And it snapped me out of it. I locked my head forward. I stared at that side wall so hard my eyes watered. And I made a decision. The same decision I'd made once already that night, and should have stuck with the first time. I was leaving. But there was an open door with that thing standing between me and it, and I could not go out the way I came in without turning toward it. So I looked, without turning my head, as far to the side as my eyes would go, and I found the window, the one that had shown the light. It was to my left, closed but not shuttered, old thin glass, and I decided, for the second time in my career, that I was going out a window. I went for that window without ever turning my back on the side wall, moving sideways like a crab, keeping the thing behind me, never letting my head come around toward it. I got to the window, and I got my hands on it, and it was painted shut, decades of old paint sealing it into the frame, and it would not budge, and behind me the voice said my name a third time, closer now. So close and so wet it was almost against my ear. "Shane, look at me. It's rude not to look at a man when he's talking to you." And I stopped trying to lift the window, and I just put my arm up over my face, and I went through it. Same as the mountain cabin years later, though I didn't know that yet. Through the glass and out into the hot night, and I landed in the wet grass beside the house on my shoulder. And the glass cut me, and I did not care, because I was outside, and I had not turned around, and I had not looked at it. I came up running, and I did not stop, and I did not look back at the house, not at the window, not at the porch, nothing. I ran for my car, and I got in, and I locked the doors, and I had it started, and in reverse before I'd even caught my breath. And I backed down that dirt road as fast as I dared, with my headlights carving up the dark, and the whole way I kept my eyes on the road behind me, and I would not let them drift up to the house. And the second my tires hit the pavement at the end of Bellinger Road, all at once, the swamp came back to life. The frogs, the insects, that whole wall of night noise came roaring back in like somebody had thrown the switch the other way, and I have never in my life been so glad to hear anything. I met the other units coming, and we all went back in together, 4 cars, every light we had, and the sun coming up gray over the trees by the time we got out there. I need to tell you what we found, because it's the part that I still can't hold in my head straight. There was no house. At the end of Bellinger Road, there was swamp, and there was the flat foundation and a few brick piers of a house that had, by the look of it, burned down or fallen down a very long time ago. Old brick, sunk into the mud, with weeds and small trees grown up through the middle of where the floor would have been. Nothing had stood whole on that spot in decades. There was no porch, no tin roof, no open door, no window for me to have gone through. But my arm was cut up and bleeding, and there was glass in the wounds. Real glass. Old thin glass that the medic picked out of me later at the hospital. I'd gone through a window. There just wasn't a window there anymore, or a house to hold it. And there hadn't been for years. There was no old man. We searched that whole area, the ruins and the swamp around it, in the daylight, and there was no sign anybody had been there. No chair, no oil lamp, no white-haired old man muttering at a wall. But I found out later, digging the way I do when a thing won't leave me alone, that a family had lived at the end of Bellinger Road once, generations back, and that the last of them had been an old man who'd lived out there alone after everybody else was gone or dead, and that the story, the old low-voice story people told, was that something used to come up out of the water at night and stand outside his house and call to him, and that the old man had lived his last years never once going outside after dark, sitting up in his front room facing the inside wall, because he'd learned that whatever was out there, you were fine as long as you never turned around and never looked at it. And that one night, the story went, he must have looked, because in the morning the house was empty, and he was never found. And not too long after that, the house burned down to the piers it sat on. The 911 call was real. It's logged. A call came in from a landline at that address at 2 in the morning, connected, sat open with something breathing far away from the receiver, and disconnected. There has not been a working phone line on Bellinger Road in over 50 years. The phone company confirmed it. There was nothing out there for a call to come from. Rhonda logged it and dispatched it, and it happened. And nobody has ever explained it. I asked Rhonda about it a few days later when things had settled. I asked her why she told me not to look at it, how she knew. And she got quiet, and she looked at me for a while, and finally she said that I wasn't the first deputy she'd sent out to the end of Bellinger Road in her 40 years on that radio. And she didn't say anything else about it, and I understood that I shouldn't ask, and I never did. That's the night I wrote "Don't Go Back" at the bottom of my journal page. I kept working that county another 4 years, and I ran a lot of roads at night, and I never once went back out to Bellinger Road. And dispatch never sent me, and I've always suspected that was on purpose, that Rhonda saw to it. She's gone now. She passed a while back. I like to think she doesn't have to send anybody out there anymore. Here's the last thing, the thing I think about most. I never saw it. I never turned around, and I never looked, so I don't know what was standing behind me in that room, calling my name in a voice like water. And people ask me when I tell this, whether I wish I knew, whether I'm ever tempted, even now, to wonder what it looked like. And the answer is no. Because the old man looked once, in all those years of not looking. And whatever he saw, it was worth spending the rest of his life facing a blank wall to avoid seeing again. That's enough for me. I'll go to my grave not knowing, and I'll count that as getting off easy. Let me start by saying I love my job. I know that's a strange way to open a story like this, but it matters, because I want you to understand that I wasn't looking for anything strange to happen. I wasn't the type. I'm a practical person. I'm Reese. And back then, I was a private overnight caregiver. The kind of home health aide that families hire when they have an elderly relative who can't be left alone at night, but doesn't need a full hospital. I'd been doing it for 6 years. I'd sat with dozens of people through their final months, and I was good at it. And I'd never once seen anything I couldn't explain. The job I wanted to tell you about was for a man named Walter. He was in his late 80s, living in a big old farmhouse a good half hour outside of a small town in Vermont. And his daughter had hired me to stay with him overnight, 7 in the evening until 7 in the morning, 5 nights a week. Walter had a heart condition and the early stages of dementia, and he couldn't be trusted alone after dark. He tended to get confused at night, his daughter told me. He'd get up, wander, sometimes talk to people who weren't there. Sundowning, they call it, when dementia patients get more confused and agitated as the evening comes on. It's extremely common. I'd seen it 100 times, so when she described it, I just nodded and said I knew exactly how to handle it. And I did. For the first couple of weeks, the job was easy and even pleasant. Walter was a sweet old man when he was lucid. During the early evening, before the confusion set in, we'd play cards and he'd tell me stories about the farm, about his late wife, about the decades he'd spent in that house. He had a sharp sense of humor buried under all the years. I grew fond of him quickly. Then, most nights, around 9 or 10, he'd start to drift. He'd get restless, ask where his wife was, forget who I was, sometimes get a little frightened, and I'd gently guide him back to bed, sit with him, and eventually he'd settle and sleep. And I'd spend the quiet hours reading in the chair by his room until the sun came up and his daughter arrived to take over. It was a good arrangement, and I had no complaints, except for one thing that I noticed early on and filed away as just another symptom of his condition. Walter was afraid of the hallway. Specifically, he was afraid of the long hallway that ran from the bedrooms down to the far end of the house, where there was a closed door to a room his daughter told me they didn't use anymore. Every night when the confusion set in, Walter would look toward that hallway, and his whole face would change. He'd get quiet and watchful, and more than once, in his confused state, he'd grab my arm and tell me in this low, serious voice that I shouldn't let her walk the hall at night. That was how he said it. Don't let her walk the hall. I assumed her was his late wife, that his tangled mind was mixing up memories and fears, and I'd just soothe him and tell him everything was fine and steer him back to bed. It was sad, but it wasn't scary. Not yet. I want you to remember that hallway, though. And I want you to remember that Walter, even confused, even losing his grip on what was real, was trying to warn me about something. Because it took me far too long to understand that the one person in that house whose mind I'd written off was the only one who actually knew what was going on. The thing about working nights in an old house is that you get to know its personality. Every house has one, especially the old ones. You learn its sounds, its drafts, the way the heat comes on, the particular way the wind pushes against certain windows. And Walter's house, for all its age, had felt like a friendly place those first couple of weeks. Worn and creaky, sure, but warm. The kind of house that had held a family for a long time. I felt comfortable there. Comfortable enough that the long night hours passed easily, and I never minded being the only waking soul in it. That started to change in my third week. And like most of these things, it started with something so small I almost didn't register it. It was the smell. One night, sometime after I'd gotten Walter settled and was sitting in my chair in the hall outside his room, I caught a smell drifting up the hallway from the far end. It was perfume. A woman's perfume, old-fashioned and floral. The kind of scent an older woman might wear. It was faint, just a thread of it, and it came and went. My first thought was completely ordinary. Walter's late wife had lived in this house for over 50 years. Her things were probably still around. A house holds on to scents, especially in closed-up rooms, and maybe a draft had carried a bit of her old perfume down the hall from that unused room at the end. It was a little melancholy, but it wasn't frightening. I even found it kind of sweet. I sat there and I thought about how this had been her home, and I felt a small tenderness about it, and then the smell faded, and I went back to my book. But it kept happening. Every night, around the same time, once the house had gone fully dark and quiet, that thread of floral perfume would drift up the hallway from the far end. And I started to notice that it wasn't random. It seemed to get a little stronger each night. And it seemed, though I told myself I was imagining it, to be getting closer. The first few nights, it stayed way down at the far end of the hall by that closed door. Then it was maybe halfway down the hall. Then it was close enough that I could smell it clearly from my chair without any draft to carry it. And I began, without quite admitting it to myself, to dread the moment each night when it would arrive. Walter noticed it too. That's what really got under my skin. On the nights the smell was strong, Walter was worse. More agitated, more frightened, more insistent with his warnings about the hall. One night he woke from a doze, sat straight up in bed, and stared at his open bedroom door with such fear on his face that it made my stomach drop. He said very clearly, not confused at all in that moment, that she was coming down the hall again, and that I needed to close the door before she got to it. And the strange thing was, right as he said it, I caught that perfume stronger than I ever had, right outside the doorway, as if someone wearing it were standing just out of sight in the dark hall. I got up and I closed the bedroom door, mostly to calm him down, and I told myself I was only humoring a frightened old man. But I noticed that once the door was closed, Walter relaxed. And I noticed that I felt better with it closed too. And I noticed that I did not want to open it again for a while. I mentioned the perfume to his daughter, carefully, the next morning. I framed it lightly, said I'd noticed a floral scent at night, and wondered if it was from her mother's old things, and she gave me a look I didn't understand at the time. She went a little still, and she asked me what the scent was like, and I described it, that old-fashioned floral smell. And she said, in a flat sort of voice, that her mother had never worn perfume in her life, that her mother had been allergic to it, in fact, and that no one in the family had ever worn any strong scent in the house because of it. She said it like she was reciting a fact, but her eyes had gone somewhere else while she said it, and she changed the subject quickly after that and left for the day. I stood in that kitchen after she'd gone, and I thought about it. If the perfume wasn't her mother's, then whose was it? A house doesn't generate a scent out of nothing. And I remember looking down that long hallway toward the closed door at the end, in the clean, bright light of morning, and feeling for the first time that the house didn't feel entirely friendly anymore. It felt like it was keeping something from me, like it knew something I didn't. And I drove home that morning more unsettled than I wanted to be, telling myself it was just an old house, just an old man's confusion, just a smell. That night, the perfume made it all the way to my chair. I need to explain the layout of that hallway so the rest of this makes sense. My chair sat outside Walter's bedroom door, which was maybe 2/3 of the way down the hall toward the front of the house. Behind me, toward the front, were the stairs and the rest of the home. In front of me, the hall ran the other way, deeper into the back of the house, past a couple of empty rooms and a bathroom, all the way to that closed door at the very end. So when I sat in my chair, I was facing down the length of the dark hallway, looking toward the closed door. That's important. It means that anything coming up the hall from the far end would be coming straight toward me out of the dark, and I'd be looking right at it. That night, the house went quiet around 10. Walter asleep. His door closed the way we both seemed to prefer it now. I sat in my chair facing the dark hall with my book and my little reading lamp, the only light in that whole end of the house. And a bit before 11, the perfume arrived. Except this time it didn't drift up faint from the far end and hover down there like it had the nights before. This time it came up the hall steadily, growing stronger as it approached, until it was all around me, thick and floral and close, as if the woman wearing it had walked right up and stopped directly in front of my chair. And I sat there in that cloud of scent, in the small circle of my lamplight, staring down a hallway where I could see absolutely no one. There was nothing there. I want to be clear about that. My lamp lit the near part of the hall well enough, and there was nobody standing in it. But the perfume was as strong and as present as if a person were close enough to touch, and the air right in front of me felt different, felt occupied, in a way I can't fully describe except to say that every animal instinct I had was telling me I was not alone, that something was standing right there, and that the only reason I couldn't see it was that my eyes weren't equipped to. I did not move. I kept my eyes on my book without reading a word of it, and I stayed as still as I could. And after a while, a minute or two that felt like an hour, the scent began to fade, retreating back down the hall the way it had come, growing fainter until it was gone. And only then did I let myself breathe properly and set down my book with shaking hands. That was the night I stopped being able to tell myself it was nothing. I started paying closer attention after that, the way you do when part of you has finally accepted that something real is happening, even if the rest of you isn't ready to say so out loud. And I began to notice things I'd overlooked before. That closed door at the end of the hall, the one to the unused room, I started keeping an eye on it. And one night, as I sat facing the hall, I realized I could see in the dim light that the door was open, just a few inches. It had always been shut before. I was certain of it. Walter's daughter had told me that room stayed closed. And now it was open a crack, and beyond the crack was pure darkness. And I had the worst feeling that the darkness beyond that door was where the perfume came from, and where it went back to. I did not go down and close it. I couldn't make myself walk down that hall in the dark. Instead, I sat there watching it. And around the same time as always, the perfume came up the hall toward me, and I sat frozen while it surrounded me. And when it finally retreated, I watched the darkness at that far door, and I swear the crack got wider as the scent moved back into it. And then slowly, the door drifted shut on its own, as if something had gone back inside and closed it behind them. In the morning, I asked Walter's daughter about that room. I tried to sound casual, Said I'd noticed the door at the end of the hall and wondered what was in there. And she gave me that same still, careful look she'd given me about the perfume. She said it had been her grandmother's room a long time ago, her father's mother, who had lived with them when Walter's daughter was a little girl, back in this same house. She died in that room decades ago, and the family had more or less closed it up and left it as it was out of respect, and nobody really went in there anymore. And then she said something that made the hair stand up on my arms. She said her grandmother, Walter's mother, had been a proud, difficult woman, and that even at the very end, bedridden and dying, she'd insisted on getting dressed up every single day, doing her hair, and putting on her perfume, the same floral perfume she'd worn her whole life. Her daughter said that as a little girl, she'd always know when her grandmother was awake and moving around the house because you could smell that perfume coming down the hall before you ever saw her. I went home that morning, and I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with the curtains drawn against the daylight, and I turned it all over in my head, trying to build my way back to a reasonable explanation, the way I always had before. But I couldn't get there this time. The pieces fit too well, and they fit in the wrong direction. A woman had died in that room at the end of the hall decades ago. A woman who wore that exact perfume. A woman whose approach down the hallway you could always smell before you saw her. And now, every night, that same scent came down that same hall, growing closer and bolder. And an old man with fading memories was terrified of it and begging me not to let her walk the hall. Walter wasn't confused about a dead wife. He was remembering his dead mother. And in his tangled state, the line between decades ago and right now had worn thin enough that he could feel her coming back, the same way he'd felt her as a boy. And then he was trying to warn me. The next few nights, I did something I'm not proud of. I kept Walter's door closed the entire time, and I moved my chair. Instead of sitting facing down the hall, I turned it and pulled it back toward the stairs so I was closer to the front of the house and not looking straight down that dark corridor. I told myself it was so I could hear if anyone came up the stairs, but the truth is I just couldn't stand to face that hallway anymore, to watch that far door and wait for the smell. The perfume still came every night. I'd feel it drift up and gather around me, and I'd sit rigid in my chair, looking at the wall instead of the hall, waiting for it to pass. And every night it seemed to linger a little longer near me before it withdrew, as if it were growing curious about the new person in the house who could sense it. Then came the night everything changed, and it changed because of Walter. It was late, well past midnight, and I was in my chair when I heard Walter's door open. I turned, and there he was, standing in his doorway in his pajamas, which wasn't unusual. He got up and wandered sometimes, but his face wasn't confused. That's what stopped me. All the times before, when he got up at night, he'd had that lost, foggy look of a man who didn't know where or when he was. This time his eyes were clear. He looked at me. And he knew exactly who I was, and he said my name, which he rarely managed in the daytime, let alone at night. And he said, very calmly and very sadly, that I needed to leave, that I was a good girl, and that his mother had taken a liking to me, and that when his mother took a liking to someone, she didn't like to let them go. He said she'd kept his father in this house till the day he died, kept him from ever leaving, and that she'd done the same to Walter himself, that he'd never once managed to move away from this house his whole long life, no matter how he tried, because she wouldn't allow it. And now, he said, she'd noticed me. He said she came a little closer every night, And when she finally reached me, he said, I'd stop wanting to leave, too. I'd want to stay in the house, with them, forever. And then, right as he finished saying it, that floral perfume rolled up the hallway behind me, stronger than it had ever been, thick enough to taste, and I felt it press in all around me like a room going cold. And Walter's clear eyes lifted from my face to look at something in the hallway just past my shoulder. And whatever he saw there made his whole expression collapse into grief and fear, and he whispered, "Not to me, but to it." He said, "Please, Mother, not this one. Let this one go." I did not turn around. I have never in my life so completely not wanted to turn around. I got up out of that chair, keeping my eyes on Walter, and I walked backward toward the stairs, and the perfume followed me, staying right with me, right at my shoulder the whole way, and Walter watched the space beside me the entire time, with tears on his face, still whispering to her, still asking her to let me go. I made it to the stairs. I made it down them. And the moment I reached the bottom, the scent stopped, like it had hit a wall it couldn't cross, and it stayed up there at the top of the stairs. And I stood in the front hall shaking and looking up into the dark at the top where I couldn't go anymore. I did not go back up. I grabbed my bag and my coat, and I left that house in the middle of the night, and I sat in my car in the driveway, and I called Walter's daughter, and I woke her up, and I told her I was quitting, effective immediately, that she needed to come now because I would not go back inside, and I would not leave her father alone, but I could not stay in that house another minute. She was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then she said something I've never forgotten. She said in a tired voice, a voice that sounded like it had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, that she'd known this would happen eventually. She said she was sorry. She said every caregiver they'd ever hired for the night shift had left the same way, sooner or later, some after a few weeks and some after only a few nights, all of them fleeing in the dark and quitting on the spot, and that she'd stopped being surprised by it years ago. She said she kept hoping each new one would last, that maybe it would finally be different. But it never was. And then she said she'd come right away, and she thanked me, and she hung up. And I sat in that driveway until her headlights came up the road, and I watched her go inside her father's house alone in the dark without any hesitation at all, like a woman walking into a place she already knew too well. And then I drove home, and I never went back. I tried to put it behind me. I switched to daytime work only after that. I never took another overnight job. And for a long time, I managed not to think about it too much. But there's a reason I'm telling this story now all these years later, and it's the twist that I only understood recently. The thing that turned a scary memory into something I still can't fully sit with. About a year ago, Walter passed away. I heard about it through a mutual contact in the caregiving world. He was very old, and it wasn't a surprise, and I felt a real sadness for that sweet man who'd tried so hard to warn me. And after I heard, I got curious the way you do, and I looked up the family. I wanted to know that his daughter was okay, that she'd finally been freed from the burden of that house. And that's when I found the old records, the local history, the kind of thing you can dig up if you go looking. And I found the truth about that house and about that family. And it wasn't what I thought at all. Walter's mother, the woman whose perfume walked the hall, had not simply died in that room decades ago. She had died in that room, yes, but according to the old records, she died the same night as her husband, Walter's father, both of them, the same night, in that house. and the account of it was strange and cold, the way these old small-town records sometimes are. The husband had died first in his sleep of natural causes, and the mother, they wrote, had been found beside him the next morning, dead as well, though there was nothing physically wrong with her at all. As if she'd simply decided, upon finding him gone, that she would not be left behind, that she would not let him leave without her, and had willed herself to follow him out of pure refusal to be parted. The record used an old-fashioned phrase. It said she died of a broken will. And here's the part that made me put down my phone and just sit there for a long time. The records listed everyone who had ever lived in that house, and every single person who had lived there with her, going back generations, had died in that house. Not one of them had ever moved away. Not the husband, not Walter, not a single relative who'd ever come to stay. They all lived their whole lives in that house, and they all died in it. It was exactly what Walter had told me that last night. She didn't like to let people go. She kept them. But there was one name on the record that stopped my heart, the most recent one. Because a few months after Walter died, his daughter had died too. In the house, she'd been living there, taking care of it, the last of the family. And the way I understood it, reading between those cold official lines, she had known. She had always known. That was why she'd never seemed surprised, never seemed afraid, never hesitated to walk into that dark house alone. She wasn't brave. She was resigned. She had grown up in that house knowing she would never truly be allowed to leave it, that her grandmother's will held every one of them there until they died, and she had simply stopped fighting it a long time ago. And when I called her that night, terrified, begging to be let go, and she said she was sorry, and that she'd known this would happen, she wasn't only talking about the caregivers who fled. She was telling me the truth about her own life. She was telling me I was the lucky one, because I got to leave. I still don't wear floral perfume. I can't stand the smell of it. And on the rare nights when I catch a thread of it somewhere, in a store, on a stranger, drifting past me in the dark, I stop breathing for just a second. And I have to remind myself where I am, and that I got out, and that whatever it was in that hallway was reaching for me, but never quite closed its hand. I think about that old woman still standing at the top of those stairs in a house full of everyone she ever refused to let go of. And I think about how close I came to becoming one more name on that list. And I'm grateful every single day that a frightened old man loved a stranger enough to beg his own dead mother to spare her. So there's this website where people pay you to watch their houses while they're on vacation. You water the plants, feed the cat, bring in the mail, that kind of thing. Sometimes you stay overnight, sometimes you just stop by. I'd been doing it for a couple of years to make extra money on top of my regular job, and I was good at it. Reliable, careful, good reviews. I'm Cole, I was 30 at the time, and I had done probably 40 of these jobs without a single problem. That track record is exactly why I didn't think twice about the one I'm going to tell you about. It looked like all the others. That's the thing about the worst experiences of your life. They almost never come with a warning label. The listing was for a house up in the hills outside of a mid-sized town in Oregon. Big property, older place, set back from the road with a long gravel driveway, and a lot of trees around it. The owners were an older couple heading overseas for 2 full weeks, and they wanted someone to stay the whole time, live in the house, keep it looking occupied, and take care of an aging dog named Biscuit, who couldn't be left alone. The pay was excellent, way above the usual rate. 2 weeks of living rent-free in a beautiful house in the woods with a sweet old dog for company. and getting paid handsomely on top of it. I remember reading the listing and thinking it was almost too good and then talking myself right out of that thought. Because good jobs do come along sometimes, and you don't get them by being suspicious of everyone. I did a video call with the wife, Diane, before accepting. She seemed lovely, warm, chatty, a little scattered in the way older people sometimes are, showing me around the house on her phone camera and pointing out where things were. The kitchen, the guest room where I'd sleep, the dog's food, the plants. It all looked exactly as nice as the pictures. Near the end of the call, she got a bit more serious and went over what she called the house rules. And honestly, most of them were completely normal. Don't leave the stove on. Keep the gate closed so Biscuit doesn't wander. Water the garden every other evening. But there was one rule that stood out, and she said it in a lighter voice than the others, almost like she was embarrassed to bring it up. She said that at night, no matter what, I should keep the door to the basement locked, and I should never, ever open it after dark. She said the lock was on my side, the kitchen side, and the key hung on a little hook next to the door. During the day, it was fine, she said. If I needed to get down there to check the water heater or whatever, daytime was no problem. But once the sun went down, the basement door stayed shut and locked until morning. She laughed a little when she said it, and told me it was just an old house thing, that the previous house sitters had always found it silly, and that I shouldn't worry about it. I said sure, no problem, and I meant it. In this line of work, you get all kinds of quirky rules. People are weird about their homes. I once had a client who made me promise not to sit on one specific chair, so a locked basement door at night barely registered as strange. I figured they had something down there they didn't want damaged, or an old furnace that made noise, or they were just superstitious. I agreed to everything. We settled the details, and a week later I drove up to that house in the hills to start the job. If I had known then what I know now, I would have turned that car around at the end of the driveway and never looked back. The couple was still there when I arrived, packing the last of their bags into their car. Diane was exactly like she'd been on the video call, warm and a little frazzled, fussing over Biscuit and giving me a rapid tour of everything I already half knew. Her husband, Ray, was quieter, older than her, tall, kind of stooped, with a way of watching me that I told myself was just an old man being protective of his home. He shook my hand and thanked me for coming, and his grip was firmer than I expected, and he held on to my hand for a beat longer than felt normal while he looked at me. Then he let go and went back to loading the car, and I let the moment slide out of my mind. Biscuit turned out to be the best thing about the whole setup. He was a big old golden retriever, gray around the muzzle, slow and gentle, the kind of dog that just wants to be near you. He took to me right away, leaning his whole weight against my leg while Diane went through the feeding instructions. I've always been a dog person, and I remember thinking that 2 weeks with a dog like this was going to make the job feel less like work and more like a vacation. Before they left, Diane walked me to the kitchen one more time and showed me the basement door. It was a heavy old wooden door in the corner of the kitchen, painted the same cream color as the walls, with a deadbolt that had clearly been added later, newer and shinier than the rest of the hardware. The key hung on a small brass hook beside the frame, just like she'd said. She turned the deadbolt to show me it was locked, tested the handle, and then she looked at me and repeated the rule one more time, and this time she didn't laugh. She said, and I remember this clearly, that whatever I heard at night, I was to leave the door locked and stay upstairs, whatever I heard. Those were the words she used, and something about the way she said them, quiet and steady, with her eyes right on mine, made the back of my neck feel cold for just a second. Then Ray called from the driveway that they needed to go, and her whole face changed back to the warm, scattered woman from before. And she squeezed my arm and thanked me again and told me Biscuit would keep me company. And then they were gone, the car crunching away down the long gravel drive, and it was just me and the dog in that big quiet house in the trees. The first few days were genuinely wonderful. I want to say that clearly because it makes what came later even harder to explain. I fell into an easy rhythm. I'd get up, feed Biscuit, take him on a slow walk around the property, do a little work on my laptop, water the garden in the evening. The house was gorgeous, full of light during the day, with big windows looking out into the woods. I cooked myself nice meals in the kitchen. I read books in a big armchair by the fireplace with the dog snoring at my feet. It was, for those first few days, exactly the peaceful escape I'd hoped for. I did notice the basement door, of course. It's hard not to notice a door you've been told never to open. During the day, I opened it once, just to look. Because I'm human, and the rule made me curious. There was nothing sinister down there that I could see. Wooden stairs going down into a large, unfinished basement. Concrete floor, a water heater, some shelving with old paint cans and tools, a few cardboard boxes. It smelled like earth and dust the way basements do. I flicked on the light, looked around from the top of the stairs, saw nothing but ordinary basement stuff, and shut the door again. Whatever the rule was about, it wasn't about anything visible. I locked it back up and put it out of my mind. The nights at first were fine too. I'd lock the basement door before bed like I'd promised, hang the key back on its hook, and go up to the guest room with Biscuit, who slept on a big cushion in the corner. The house made the usual sounds an old house in the woods makes. Wind in the trees, the structure settling, the occasional creak. I slept well. 3 nights went by like that, calm and uneventful. And I settled comfortably into the belief that the basement rule was exactly what Diane had said it was, an old house superstition, nothing more. The 4th night is when Biscuit changed. It was late, past midnight, and I was reading in bed with the dog asleep in his corner. And at some point, I became aware that he wasn't asleep anymore. He was awake, and he was standing up facing the closed bedroom door, completely still. Not growling, not barking, just standing there rigid with his ears up and his whole body pointed at the door like he was listening to something on the other side of it. I watched him for a minute, and he didn't move a muscle. I said his name softly, and he didn't even glance at me. It was like I wasn't there. Every bit of his attention was fixed on something below us, down through the floor, down toward the kitchen, and I realized after a moment that what he was really pointed at, in a straight line down through the house, was the basement. I told myself he'd heard a raccoon or a possum outside, or a mouse in the walls. Dogs hear all kinds of things we can't. But he stayed like that for a long time. This old gentle dog turned to stone in the corner of the room, and eventually, without any sound that I could hear, whatever he'd been listening to seemed to stop, and he slowly lay back, down. But he didn't really sleep after that. He kept his head up, resting on his paws, his eyes open in the dark, and neither of us slept much that night. The next morning, everything was normal again. Biscuit was his usual self, happy and slow and leaning on me while I made his breakfast. And the sun was coming through those big windows, and the whole thing from the night before felt like nothing. I actually felt a little foolish for how tense I'd gotten, watching a dog stare at a door. That's the pattern with all of this, I've come to realize. Daylight erases everything, and it lets you keep going. But I'll admit, the 5th night I went to bed a little more alert than usual, part of me waiting to see if the dog would do it again. And he did. Same time roughly, a little after midnight. I was drifting off when I felt the mattress shift as Biscuit got up, and I opened my eyes and there he was, standing in the same spot, pointed at the same door, rigid and silent. Except this time it lasted longer. And this time, near the end of it, he did something he hadn't done before. He backed up. Slowly, one careful step at a time, he backed away from the bedroom door until his hindquarters were pressed against the far wall, as far from the door as he could get. And he stayed there, low and tense, staring. Whatever he was hearing, he didn't want to be near it. And a dog that wants to get away from something is a very different thing than a dog that's just curious about a noise. That was the night I first heard it myself. I'd been so focused on the dog that I'd been holding my own breath. And in that stretched out silence with Biscuit pressed against the wall, I heard a sound come up from below. It was faint, and it came through the floor, from somewhere deep in the house. It was the basement door. I knew the sound of that door by then, the specific heavy creak of it, because I'd opened and closed it myself. And what I heard was that creak, soft and slow. The sound of that heavy wooden door being eased open down in the kitchen, followed by nothing. Just silence again. But a different silence. A waiting one. I lay completely still. My mind went to the only sane place it could go. Someone had broken into the house. Someone was down there. That was a real, human, terrifying thought. And it was almost a relief compared to the alternative, because a burglar is something you can understand. I reached for my phone, ready to call for help, my heart going hard. And then I ran through it in my head. The basement door only locks and unlocks from the kitchen side. I had locked it myself before bed. I had hung the key on its hook. For that door to open, someone would have had to already be inside the house, in the kitchen, to turn the deadbolt. Or someone would have had to already be down in the basement, and there was no way out of that basement except up through that one door into the kitchen. I had seen it myself. No other exit, no outside entrance, just the one door. So if the basement door had just opened, then whatever opened it had been down there the whole time. Down there while I ate my meals in the kitchen, 10 feet away. Down there while I read in the armchair. Down there, in the dark, on the other side of a door I looked at every single day. I did not go downstairs. Diane's voice was in my head, clear as anything. Whatever you hear at night, leave the door locked and stay upstairs. Except the door was open now. I'd heard it open, so her instruction didn't even fully apply anymore, and that scared me more than if it had. I stayed in that bed with the lights off and my phone in my hand and the dog pressed against the wall. And I listened to the house with everything I had. For a long time there was nothing. And then I heard the stairs, not the basement stairs. The main staircase, the one that came up from the first floor to the second, to the hallway right outside my room. I heard the bottom step take weight, a low, slow groan of old wood. Then, after a pause, the next one, something was coming up the stairs, and it was doing it the way you'd climb stairs if you were trying to be quiet and failing, or if you simply didn't care how long it took because you knew nobody was going anywhere. Slow, even, patient. And with each step, Biscuit pressed himself harder against the wall, and I saw in the faint light that his lips were pulled back, but he wasn't making a sound. This friendly, gentle old dog was showing his teeth in total silence, too afraid to even growl. The steps reached the top of the staircase, and then they came down the hall, toward my door. Slow footfalls on the hallway floor, unhurried until they stopped, right outside the bedroom. There was a gap under the door, and I could see the faint line of the hall light I'd left on out there. And as I stared at that thin, bright line, part of it went dark. 2 patches of the light under the door were blocked, side by side, the exact width apart that a pair of feet would be, as if someone was standing directly on the other side of the door, facing it, their feet breaking the light. And they just stood there. They didn't try the handle. They didn't push. They stood outside my door in the dark hallway of that house in the woods. And I lay frozen in the bed a few feet away. And the only sound in the entire world was my own heartbeat and the old dog breathing fast against the wall. I don't know how long the feet stayed outside my door. Time does something strange when you're that afraid. It could have been 2 minutes or 20. I lay there watching those 2 dark patches break the light under the door, not daring to move, not daring to make a sound. My thumb resting on my phone screen, but too scared to even light it up in case the glow showed under the door and told whatever it was exactly where I was. I kept waiting for the handle to turn. It never did. And somehow that was worse. It felt like it wasn't trying to get in. It felt like it just wanted to stand there, on the other side of that thin door close to me, and let me know it could. Then the patches of shadow slid away. The light under the door came back, full and unbroken. And I heard the footsteps go back down the hall, slow and even, and down the stairs, and eventually faintly, from far below, I heard that heavy basement door creak shut again. And then the deadbolt. I heard the deadbolt turn. A locked door, locking itself from the inside, from the kitchen side, when there was no one in that house but me and a terrified dog upstairs. I did not sleep. I sat up against the headboard with every light in the room on, and Biscuit finally coming to press against me instead of the wall, both of us just waiting for the windows to turn gray. When morning finally came, I went downstairs slowly, carefully, half expecting to find something. The kitchen was exactly as I'd left it. The basement door was closed. The deadbolt was thrown, locked, and the key was hanging on its little brass hook, right where it always was. Everything was perfectly, completely normal. If I hadn't spent the whole night living through it, I'd have sworn nothing had happened at all. That day, I almost left. I sat in my car in the driveway with the engine running and Biscuit watching me from the window of the house, and I came so close to just driving away and messaging the couple that there'd been an emergency, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave that old dog alone in there, not with whatever that was. And there was still a stubborn, shrinking part of me trying to be reasonable, trying to find the version of events where I'd half dreamed it, where old houses make noises and scared minds fill in the rest. So I stayed. God help me, I stayed. But I made a decision. I was going to find out what was in that basement in the daylight when the rule said it was safe, so that I could prove to myself there was nothing to be afraid of. I waited until the sun was high and bright. Early afternoon, as far from the dark as I could get. I took the key off the hook. My hands weren't steady, but I did it. Biscuit would not come near the kitchen. He stood back in the living room doorway watching me, and that alone almost made me stop. I turned the deadbolt, and I opened the basement door, and I turned on the light, and I went down. It looked the same as before. Concrete floor, water heater, shelves, boxes. I made myself walk all the way down and actually look around instead of peering from the top of the stairs like I had the first time. And at first there was nothing. It was just a basement. But then I noticed, in the far corner, past the water heater, an area I hadn't been able to see from the stairs. The concrete floor there was different. There was a section, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet, where the concrete was newer. A slightly different color, a slightly different texture, poured in a rectangle and smoothed over, clearly done at a different time than the rest of the floor. It was the shape and size of exactly one thing, and my mind knew what that shape was before I let myself think the word. And set into the wall right above that patch of newer concrete, at about chest height, there was a small vent, an air vent, an old metal grate, the kind that would connect ductwork running up through the house. I stood there looking at that patch in the floor and that vent in the wall, and I felt the whole thing click into place in a way I did not want it to, because that vent, that duct, would run straight up through the walls, up to the second floor, up maybe to the hallway right outside the guest room where I slept. And whatever the couple had done down here, whatever was under that fresh concrete, was connected to the rest of the house by that vent, by that dark path running up through the walls, and it did not stay under the concrete at night. I got out of that basement so fast I nearly fell up the stairs. I slammed the door, threw the deadbolt, hung the key back, and I stood in the middle of the kitchen shaking. And that's when I finally did what I should have done days earlier. I looked up the address, the house, the couple, everything. And I found it. A local news story from about 3 years back. And I sat down on the kitchen floor to read it, because my legs wouldn't hold me. The news story was short. The kind of local piece that gets written once and then forgotten. It was about a house sitter, a young man around my age who had taken a job watching a house in the hills for a couple who were traveling. He'd stopped responding to the owners partway through the job. When they got worried and called someone to check on the place, the house sitter was gone. His car was still in the driveway. His phone and his bag were still in the guest room, but he himself had simply vanished, and he was never found. The article had a photo of the missing man, and it had a photo of the house. It was this house. The same long gravel driveway, the same big windows, the same door. But the couple in the story weren't Diane and Ray. They were different people entirely, with different names, which meant Diane and Ray had bought this house sometime after a man disappeared from inside it without a trace, and they had added a deadbolt to the basement door on the kitchen side, and they had made a rule that it stay locked at night, and they had hired someone to stay in the house alone for 2 weeks and never told them why. I don't think they were bad people. I want to say that. I've thought about it a lot since, and I honestly don't think Diane and Ray did anything to that missing man. I think they moved into a house that already had something in it, something under that patch of concrete that the previous owners had poured, something that came up through the vents at night. I think they learned to live with it the only way you can, by locking the door and staying upstairs and never, ever going down there after dark. And I think when they wanted a vacation, they knew they couldn't leave the house empty. Because an empty house at night with that thing in it was a worse idea than a house with a warm body in it and a locked door between them. I think that's what I was, not a house sitter. A locked door made of flesh. Someone to keep the thing occupied. Someone for it to stand outside of, so that it wouldn't go looking for a way out into the world while they were gone. I packed my bag in about 4 minutes. I picked up Biscuit's leash and his food, and I put that old dog in my car, because there was no power on earth that would have made me leave him in that house, and I drove down the gravel driveway, and I did not stop until I was back in a town with streetlights and people. I messaged Diane that there'd been a family emergency and I'd had to leave, and that a friend was watching the house. I lied. I told her I'd left the key under the mat and everything was locked up. She wrote back that it was fine, that she understood, and she thanked me, and she never once asked about the dog. I kept Biscuit. Nobody ever came for him. He lived another 2 good years with me, and he never again, not once in all that time, stood and stared at a closed door in the dark. Here's the part I still can't put down, though. The part that keeps me up on the nights when I let myself think about it. Before I left, in those last frantic minutes, I did one more search. I looked up the couple who'd owned the house when that first man disappeared. The names from the news story. I wanted to know what happened to them, whether they'd sold up and moved away like anyone would, and I found them. I found a second article from a year or so after the first. The couple who used to own that house had died, both of them, and the article said they'd passed away while traveling overseas, on vacation, far from home, in an accident that the piece described as strange and unexplained. They'd left their house with a sitter and gone on a trip and never come back. I don't know what's under the concrete in that basement. I don't know what stood outside my door in the dark, breaking the light with its feet, or what came up through the vents at night, or why it lets you live as long as you keep the door locked and stay where you belong. But I know that the couple who first tried to keep it, who first poured that concrete and added that lock, went on a vacation and died far from home. And I know Diane and Ray went on a vacation too. I never heard from them again after that one message. Their listing came down. I've checked more than once over the years, and I've never been able to find out what became of them. And I've never had the courage to drive back up into those hills to see if anyone lives in that house now, or whether the gravel driveway is empty and the windows are dark and something is waiting inside for the next warm body to come and stand between it and the door.